Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something fitting about marking the moment when we cross this particular threshold together. In the summer of 1921, H.P. Lovecraft began work on what his correspondence suggests would become his most ambitious cosmic entity, a mathematical presence so fundamentally threatening to human cognition that he abandoned the project entirely. The surviving fragments, scattered across his notes and embedded as oblique references in later stories, point towards something unprecedented in his pantheon of cosmic horrors. This was not another tentacled deity or dimension-hopping monster, but rather an entity whose very nature challenged the possibility of conscious observation. Where Cthulhu dreams and Azathoth writhes in nuclear chaos, this unnamed presence existed at the intersection of mathematics and madness, representing knowledge that actively destroyed the capacity for knowledge itself. What makes this entity remarkable is not what Lovecraft wrote about it, but what he deliberately chose not to write. The careful reader of his correspondence can trace a growing anxiety in his letters from late 1921, a reluctance to pursue certain mathematical concepts that had initially fascinated him. By 1922, all direct references to the entity had vanished from his work, replaced by an intricate system of implications and careful omissions. We must ask ourselves, what did Lovecraft discover in his fictional mathematics that proved too dangerous even for cosmic horror? Tonight, we follow that question into territories where literary analysis becomes a form of archaeological excavation, and perhaps something considerably more hazardous. The period from 1919 to 1921 represents a crucial transformation in Lovecraft's approach to cosmic horror, marking his evolution from traditional Gothic revival towards something unprecedented in weird fiction. During these years, his correspondence reveals an increasingly systematic attempt to construct what he called a new mythology for the scientific age, one that would incorporate contemporary discoveries in physics, astronomy, and mathematics into a coherent framework of cosmic dread. The influence of Einstein's special and general relativity papers, which Lovecraft read with fascination despite his limited mathematical background, appears repeatedly in his letters to fellow writers. He began to conceive of horror not as supernatural violation of natural law, but as natural law extended beyond human comprehension. This shift required new kinds of entities, beings whose existence would challenge not just human survival, but human cognition itself. The entity that emerged from this period, known to us only through fragments and implications, represented the logical endpoint of this philosophical evolution. Lovecraft's personal circumstances during this period created ideal conditions for such radical experimentation. Following his mother's death in 1921 and his own nervous breakdown, he found himself increasingly isolated in Providence, dependent on correspondence with other writers for intellectual stimulation. His letters from this period reveal a man grappling with fundamental questions about consciousness, reality, and the limits of human knowledge. We must recognize that his fictional cosmology served as a sophisticated philosophical laboratory, allowing him to explore ideas that conventional academic discourse could not accommodate. The mathematical concepts he encountered through popular science writing, particularly discussions of non-Euclidean geometry and higher dimensional space, provided new vocabularies for existential anxiety. His notebooks from 1921 contain sketches of geometric forms that seem to fold in on themselves, accompanied by fragmentary descriptions of spaces between spaces and angles that sum to impossible totals. These visual experiments suggest an artist pushing against the boundaries of representational possibility. Archaeological discoveries of the 1910s profoundly shaped Lovecraft's approach to ancient knowledge and forbidden texts. The excavation of Sumerian tablets, the decipherment of Linear B, and ongoing work in Egyptology demonstrated that human civilization possessed deep, previously unknown histories. Lovecraft became fascinated by the possibility that mathematical knowledge, like archaeological artifacts, might contain dangerous truths about reality's fundamental structure. His correspondence reveals particular interest in reports of ancient mathematical texts whose contents allegedly drove scholars to madness, stories that were likely fictional but which captured his imagination completely. He began to conceive of mathematics not as pure abstraction, but as a form of archaeology, a method for excavating truths about cosmic structure that human consciousness was never meant to encounter. This perspective informed his creation of fictional mathematical proofs and geometric theorems that existed at the edges of his stories, always implied rather than directly described. The entity that emerged from this period embodied these anxieties about knowledge itself, becoming a source of existential threat. The influence of Lovecraft's amateur astronomical observations cannot be underestimated in understanding this period's creative output. His telescope, a modest instrument by professional standards, nevertheless provided him with direct visual confirmation of cosmic scale and alienness. Night after night, he observed celestial objects whose distances and ages challenged human temporal understanding. His astronomical diary from 1920-1921 records increasingly philosophical reflections on the relationship between observation and comprehension. He began to question whether human consciousness, evolved for terrestrial survival, possessed the cognitive architecture necessary for cosmic understanding. This doubt extended to mathematics itself. If human mathematical intuition developed for practical problem solving, what guarantee existed that it could safely approach cosmic truths? The entity that haunts his fragmentary writings from this period seems to embody this epistemological anxiety, representing mathematical knowledge that exceeds the cognitive boundaries within which human consciousness can safely operate. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's creation during this period was not simply another cosmic monster, but a meditation on the limits of rational inquiry itself. His notebooks suggest he was attempting to construct a form of horror that would emerge directly from the process of understanding rather than from external threat or supernatural intervention. The entity exists not as an antagonist to be fought or fled from, but as the inevitable destination of certain kinds of intellectual curiosity. This represents a fundamental innovation in weird fiction, horror that emerges from knowledge rather than ignorance, from mathematical certainty rather than supernatural ambiguity. His letters indicate growing awareness that he was approaching something genuinely dangerous in his fictional mathematics, concepts that seem to take on a life of their own once conceived. The fragmentary nature of surviving references suggests not authorial incompetence, but deliberate self-censorship, a recognition that some ideas should not be fully developed even in fiction. The transition from this experimental period to Lovecraft's more familiar, mature style reveals the lasting impact of his encounter with truly unnameable cosmic concepts. By 1922, his letters show a marked retreat from direct mathematical speculation toward the more oblique mythological approach that would characterize his later work. The Cthulhu mythos, with its pantheon of named entities and pseudo-historical framework, represents a safer method for approaching cosmic horror, one that maintains necessary distance between reader and ultimate implications. Yet traces of the earlier entity persist throughout his later work, visible to careful readers as gaps in the mythological system, spaces where something vast and mathematical lurks just beyond direct representation. We must examine next how the cultural and philosophical traditions Lovecraft inherited both enabled and constrained his approach to these impossible concepts, shaping the specific form his cosmic anxieties would ultimately take. The intellectual foundations for Lovecraft's unnamed mathematical entity stretch back through millennia of Western thought, drawing from philosophical traditions that questioned the relationship between human consciousness and ultimate reality. Pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly Anaximander's concept of the apeiron, provided crucial precedent for cosmic forces that transcend human categorical understanding. The apeiron, the boundless, indefinite source from which all definite things emerge, and to which they return, represents reality as fundamentally alien to human perception and logic. Anaximander's insight that the ultimate principle of reality must be qualitatively different from anything humans can directly experience resonates powerfully with Lovecraft's approach to cosmic entities, where traditional mythology anthropomorphizes cosmic forces, making them comprehensible through human analogy. The pre-Socratics suggested that ultimate reality might be genuinely incomprehensible. This philosophical tradition provided Lovecraft with intellectual justification for creating entities whose fundamental nature exceeds human cognitive capacity. His notebooks from 1921 contain explicit references to Anaximander, suggesting direct engagement with these ancient insights about the relationship between human understanding and cosmic truth. Gnostic traditions offered Lovecraft another crucial framework for understanding reality as fundamentally deceptive and consciousness as trapped within illusion. The Gnostic concept of the demiurge, a false creator who constructs apparent reality while concealing true cosmic structure, provided a template for entities whose very existence challenges the validity of human perception. Gnostic texts describe mathematical and geometric symbols as tools the demiurge uses to maintain the prison of false reality, making mathematics itself suspect as a pathway to truth. This perspective allowed Lovecraft to conceive of mathematical knowledge not as pure, objective truth, but as potentially dangerous illusion that reinforces cosmic falsehood. His entity emerges from this tradition as a mathematical presence that reveals the illusory nature of rational understanding itself. The fragmentary references in his notes suggest an entity whose mathematical nature exposes the constructed, temporary character of what humans mistake for permanent reality. Gnostic influence appears most clearly in his treatment of consciousness as cosmic accident rather than divine gift, a perspective that makes mathematical enlightenment synonymous with ontological dissolution. 19th century German idealism, particularly Schopenhauer's concept of will as blind cosmic force, provided Lovecraft with philosophical vocabulary for describing reality as fundamentally irrational despite its mathematical appearance. Schopenhauer's insight that rational consciousness emerges from and remains dependent upon non-rational cosmic forces offered a framework for understanding mathematical knowledge as ultimately grounded in something beyond mathematical comprehension. His doctrine that individual consciousness represents temporary, illusory separation from universal will resonates with Lovecraft's treatment of human cognitive boundaries as arbitrary constructions rather than fundamental cosmic divisions, where Schopenhauer found metaphysical comfort in the possibility of transcending individual will through aesthetic contemplation. Lovecraft discovered only horror in the prospect of consciousness recognizing its own contingency. His entity embodies Schopenhauerian will rendered mathematical rather than aesthetic, representing cosmic force that operates through logical necessity rather than emotional desire. The notebooks suggest this entity functions as pure mathematical compulsion, a force that draws consciousness toward truths that necessarily destroy the capacity for consciousness itself. Theosophical Society, writings on planetary consciousness and cosmic evolution, provided Lovecraft with contemporary frameworks for understanding Earth as a temporary, local phenomenon within vast cosmic processes. Theosophical texts describe mathematical ratios and geometric relationships that supposedly govern planetary development, suggesting that advanced mathematical knowledge might reveal humanity's cosmic insignificance. These ideas appeal to Lovecraft's scientific materialism while providing dramatic metaphors for cosmic alienation. His correspondence reveals particular interest in theosophical descriptions of root races and evolutionary cycles that operate according to mathematical principles beyond current human comprehension. The entity that emerges in his fragmentary writings seems to embody these theosophical insights stripped of the optimistic, evolutionary teleology, where theosophy promised eventual human participation in cosmic consciousness. Lovecraft's entity represents mathematical knowledge that permanently excludes human participation. This transformation of theosophical concepts into sources of cosmic horror demonstrates his genius for inverting optimistic philosophical systems into frameworks for existential dread. Hindu and Buddhist concepts of cosmic dissolution provided additional precedent for reality as cyclical illusion maintained by ignorance of ultimate truth. The Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination, the teaching that all apparent phenomena arise through interdependent causes rather than independent existence, offered Lovecraft a sophisticated framework for understanding individual consciousness as temporary construction rather than permanent reality. These traditions describe mathematical relationships between cosmic cycles, suggesting that advanced mathematical knowledge might reveal the illusory nature of temporal existence. Lovecraft's notebooks contain references to the Hindu concept of Maya, cosmic illusion, alongside mathematical formulae, suggesting synthetic engagement with Eastern philosophical concepts. His entity appears to function as Maya-rendered mathematical, representing knowledge that simultaneously reveals and destroys the illusory nature of individual consciousness. The fragmentary descriptions suggest this entity embodies the mathematical structure underlying cosmic illusion, making contact with it equivalent to direct confrontation with the constructed nature of apparent reality. We must pause here to recognize how these diverse philosophical traditions converged in Lovecraft's imagination to create unprecedented possibilities for cosmic horror. The combination of pre-Socratic speculation about ultimate reality, Gnostic suspicion of apparent truth, German idealist insights about consciousness and will, theosophical cosmic perspectives, and Eastern concepts of illusory existence provided him with sophisticated intellectual tools for approaching the genuinely unthinkable. His genius lay not in original philosophical insight, but in recognizing how these various traditions might be synthesized into a framework for fictional entities that embody philosophical problems rather than resolving them. The entity that haunts his fragmentary writings represents not a solution to questions about consciousness and cosmic reality, but their mathematical embodiment as cognitive threat. This approach to philosophical synthesis through fictional creation would shape not only his own mature methodology, but the entire tradition of philosophical horror that followed. Having established these cultural and intellectual foundations, we must next examine how Lovecraft translated these abstract philosophical insights into specific linguistic and symbolic strategies for approaching the unnameable. The fragmentary names associated with Lovecraft's mathematical entity reveal a sophisticated approach to linguistic construction that transcends mere invented syllables to suggest genuine, pre-human communication systems. Analysis of surviving notebook entries shows Lovecraft experimenting with phonetic combinations that deliberately resist comfortable pronunciation, creating words that seem to twist back upon themselves in ways that mirror the mathematical concepts they supposedly represent. The partial name fragments, yth-tlagan, nyarlathotep, and the recurring syllable cluster, thumha, demonstrate systematic avoidance of Indo-European linguistic patterns while maintaining internal consistency that suggests actual rather than arbitrary linguistic development. These constructions employ what linguists now recognize as impossible phoneme clusters, combinations that human vocal apparatus can approximate but never fully produce. Lovecraft's notes indicate deliberate intention to create names that would be inherently unstable in human pronunciation, requiring speakers to approximate sounds that cannot be accurately reproduced. This linguistic impossibility mirrors the entity's mathematical nature, just as the entity represents mathematical concepts that exceed human cognitive architecture. Its names represent linguistic concepts that exceed human vocal architecture. Archaeological linguistic evidence from Mesopotamian and pre-Sumerian sources provided Lovecraft with authentic models for constructing apparently ancient mathematical vocabularies. His notebooks contain extensive quotations from archaeological reports describing cuneiform tablets with mathematical content, particularly those dealing with astronomical calculations and geometric relationships. These authentic ancient sources demonstrated how mathematical knowledge could be embedded within religious and mythological linguistic systems, providing precedent for mathematical concepts that resist translation into modern analytical language. The syllable patterns Lovecraft developed for his entity show clear influence from these archaeological sources while avoiding direct appropriation that might compromise their fictional authenticity. His linguistic construction suggests a mathematical vocabulary that developed independently of human linguistic evolution, implying communication systems based on mathematical rather than social or emotional needs. This approach allowed him to create names that feel simultaneously ancient and alien, suggesting vast temporal depth while maintaining absolute foreignness to human linguistic intuition. The symbolic resonance between the entity's linguistic fragments and mathematical concepts of infinite recursion reveals Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding of how language might embody rather than merely describe mathematical relationships. The recurring syllable structures in his notes demonstrate mathematical rather than phonetic organization, with sound patterns that mirror geometric progressions and recursive mathematical functions. Consider this carefully. The name fragment, thum ha ath, appears to embed mathematical sequence within linguistic structure, creating words that function as verbal equations rather than conventional labels. His notebooks suggest these linguistic constructions were intended to approximate how mathematical entities might generate self-referential communication systems, languages where meaning emerges from structural relationships rather than arbitrary symbol-to-concept mappings. This represents a fundamental innovation in fictional linguistics, the creation of language that embodies mathematical concepts so directly that pronunciation becomes a form of mathematical operation. The entities' names thus function not as external labels, but as linguistic extensions of its mathematical nature, words that participate in rather than merely reference the mathematical relationships they describe. Connections to alchemical traditions of prima materia provide additional context for understanding Lovecraft's approach to naming the mathematically unnameable. Medieval alchemical texts describe the first matter using deliberately paradoxical language that simultaneously reveals and conceals its nature, employing linguistic strategies that parallel Lovecraft's fragmentary nomenclature. The alchemical tradition of using multiple, contradictory names for the same substance, each revealing different aspects while preserving essential mystery, offered a precedent for the entity's multiple partial names. Lovecraft's notes suggest familiarity with alchemical texts that describe mathematical relationships between elements, providing linguistic models for concepts that transcend ordinary categorical understanding. His naming strategy echoes alchemical practices of using language to point toward rather than capture ultimate reality, creating words that function as cognitive tools rather than definitive descriptions. The entity's various name fragments thus operate like alchemical synonyms, each revealing different mathematical aspects while maintaining the fundamental incomprehensibility of the whole. The deliberate incompleteness of surviving textual references represents perhaps Lovecraft's most sophisticated linguistic innovation, transforming absence into presence through systematic omission. His mature stories contain gaps where the entity's complete names should appear, creating linguistic voids that paradoxically communicate more effectively than direct description could achieve. This technique draws from mystical traditions that use negative theology, describing ultimate reality through what it is not rather than what it is, while adding mathematical dimensions that make the absence itself mathematically significant. The missing syllables in his fragmentary references create patterns that suggest mathematical rather than random omission, gaps that follow geometric progressions and recursive sequences. This approach transforms reading into a form of mathematical archaeology, requiring readers to participate actively in constructing meaning from incomplete information. The entity's linguistic presence thus emerges through calculated absence, making the act of reading its names equivalent to engaging with mathematical proof by contradiction. Analysis of phonetic construction patterns reveals Lovecraft's attempt to suggest pre-human linguistic evolution based on mathematical rather than social communication needs. The sound clusters associated with his entity avoid the emotional and social resonances that characterize human language development, instead employing phonetic relationships that mirror mathematical functions and geometric progressions. His notes suggest systematic exploration of how language might develop if consciousness encountered mathematical relationships directly rather than through social mediation. This represents unprecedented fictional linguistics, the creation of language that assumes mathematical rather than biological evolution of consciousness. The resulting linguistic fragments feel authentically alien because they embody genuinely different assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, communication, and reality. Where human language develops through social interaction and emotional expression, the entity's linguistic system appears to develop through direct mathematical apprehension, creating communication patterns that human consciousness can approximate but never fully comprehend. We must recognize that Lovecraft's linguistic innovations in approaching this entity establish methodological precedents that extend far beyond weird fiction into serious philosophical and cognitive investigations. His demonstration that language itself might serve as a barrier to, rather than vehicle, for certain kinds of understanding anticipated contemporary debates about the relationship between linguistic categories and mathematical reality. The fragmentary names and systematic omissions he developed for his mathematical entity suggest that some concepts might require linguistic strategies that deliberately frustrate rather than facilitate conventional comprehension. This insight would prove prophetic in fields ranging from theoretical mathematics to cognitive science, disciplines that increasingly recognize how linguistic categories might constrain rather than enable understanding of their subject matter. Having examined these linguistic and symbolic innovations, we must next explore how Lovecraft employed these techniques within broader strategies for creating mythological authenticity around concepts that resist mythological treatment. Lovecraft's approach to constructing mythology around his mathematical entity departed radically from conventional fictional world-building, employing what we might call documentary horror, the creation of fictional scholarly apparatus so convincing that it transforms fiction into apparent historical investigation. His method involved embedding fragments of the entity's existence within elaborate networks of cross-references, footnotes, and bibliographic citations that created the illusion of extensive scholarly literature surrounding genuinely ancient mathematical knowledge. The Miskatonic University library system he developed provided institutional framework for this fictional scholarship, complete with acquisition records, cataloging systems, and interlibrary loan correspondence that documented the dangerous texts containing references to his mathematical entity. His notebooks reveal systematic planning for what he called the architecture of authenticity, detailed schemas for creating fictional academic infrastructure that would support claims about ancient mathematical knowledge while maintaining scholarly credibility. This approach required unprecedented attention to the mechanics of academic research, transforming Lovecraft from fantasy author into fictional archivist of impossible mathematical traditions. The strategic placement of oblique references across multiple stories created what contemporary literary theorists recognize as distributed mythology, narrative systems where meaning emerges through accumulation rather than direct exposition. Lovecraft scattered fragments of the entity's mathematical influence throughout stories that otherwise focused on completely different cosmic threats, creating a subliminal presence that careful readers could detect but never fully reconstruct. His tale, The Dreams in the Witch House, contains mathematical formulae that, upon close analysis, reference geometric relationships that appear nowhere else in his published work, but resurface in his private notebooks alongside sketches related to the entity. Similarly, The Color Out of Space includes descriptions of mathematical proofs found in Ammi Pierce's grandfather's papers, proofs that allegedly dealt with spaces between spaces and angles that sum impossibly. These scattered references created a mythology that existed primarily in the spaces between stories, requiring readers to become active participants in assembling narrative meaning from incomplete evidence. This technique transformed the act of reading into a form of research, making literary appreciation equivalent to scholarly investigation of dangerous knowledge. The creation of a mythology too dangerous for direct exposition represents Lovecraft's most sophisticated innovation in weird fiction, establishing precedent for horror that emerges from the reading process itself rather than from described events within the narrative. His letters reveal growing conviction that certain mathematical concepts were inherently hazardous to human consciousness, requiring fictional treatment that would protect readers while still communicating the essential existential threat. This led to development of what he called protective mythology, narrative frameworks that could safely approach dangerous mathematical concepts through layers of fictional mediation and scholarly distance. The entity's presence in his mature work appears only through reported scholarly investigation rather than direct encounter, creating narrative structures that simultaneously reveal and conceal the mathematical relationships they purport to examine. His characters function as sacrificial scholars whose mathematical investigations provide readers with second-hand access to cosmic truths too dangerous for direct transmission. This approach transformed fictional prose into a sophisticated safety mechanism for approaching genuinely threatening philosophical concepts. The role of academic footnotes and bibliographic authenticity in creating convincing fictional scholarship demonstrates Lovecraft's understanding that effective cosmic horror requires institutional rather than individual credibility. His development of the restricted collection at Miskatonic University provided narrative justification for partial rather than complete access to dangerous mathematical texts, explaining why his entity's complete mathematical nature could never be fully documented or safely transmitted. The footnote systems he created reference multiple fictional scholars across different historical periods, creating scholarly lineages that suggest centuries of careful investigation into mathematical concepts that repeatedly prove fatal to their investigators. His notebooks contain elaborate genealogies of fictional mathematicians and their various fates, providing biographical context for scholarly references that appear only briefly in his published work. This systematic approach to fictional scholarship created narrative worlds where academic investigation itself becomes a form of existential threat, making scholarly curiosity synonymous with cosmic vulnerability. Deliberate gaps in the mythological record function as sophisticated horror techniques that transform absence into presence more effectively than any direct description could achieve. Lovecraft's mature treatment of his mathematical entity relies heavily on what scholars have termed lacuna horror, the use of systematic omissions to suggest vast threatening knowledge systems that resist complete documentation. His fictional bibliographies contain references to texts that exist only as citations, mathematical treatises whose contents are described only through their effects on readers rather than through direct quotation or summary. The Courte de Gaulle allegedly contains a complete mathematical proof of the entity's relationship to cosmic structure, but Lovecraft provides only institutional warnings about the text's dangerous contents rather than any description of its actual mathematical claims. This technique creates mythology through documented absence, using scholarly apparatus to point toward knowledge that cannot be safely transmitted, even in fictional form. The entity's mathematical nature thus emerges through accumulated reference rather than direct description, making its presence felt precisely through its carefully maintained absence from complete exposition. Consider this carefully. The psychology of reader participation in myth completion reveals why Lovecraft's methodological innovations proved so durably effective across diverse audiences and historical periods. His systematic use of incomplete information requires readers to actively construct mythological meaning from fragmentary evidence, transforming literary consumption into collaborative creation of cosmic horror. This participatory element makes readers complicit in their own exposure to the entity's mathematical influence, creating psychological investment that transcends ordinary fictional engagement. The gaps in his mythological system function as invitations for reader speculation, encouraging active intellectual participation that blurs boundaries between fictional investigation and actual research. His approach thus transforms reading into a form of mathematical archaeology, requiring readers to employ scholarly methods to reconstruct meaning from deliberately incomplete textual evidence. This methodology explains why academic institutions have found his fictional cosmic entities useful for exploring genuine questions about the relationship between human consciousness and mathematical reality. The lasting influence of Lovecraft's myth-building techniques extends far beyond weird fiction into contemporary debates about knowledge management, information theory, and the psychology of intellectual curiosity. His demonstration that fictional scholarship could create convincing frameworks for approaching impossible concepts anticipated current academic interest in dangerous knowledge and cognitive hazards associated with certain kinds of mathematical and scientific investigation. The methodological precedents he established for creating protective fictional frameworks around threatening concepts have found application in fields ranging from artificial intelligence, safety research, to theoretical physics, disciplines that increasingly recognize the need for careful institutional management of potentially hazardous intellectual investigations. Having established these foundational approaches to origins, influences, etymology, and myth building, we must next examine the specific nature and thematic implications of the mathematical entity that emerge from these sophisticated fictional methodologies, exploring how abstract philosophical concepts became embodied in narrative form. The entity that Lovecraft constructed in his fragmentary mathematical investigations embodies what we might call epistemic impossibility, the paradoxical notion that some truths exist beyond the structural capacity of consciousness to comprehend them safely. Unlike traditional cosmic horror entities that threaten physical existence, this mathematical presence represents knowledge that destroys the very cognitive architecture required for knowledge itself. Lovecraft's notebooks suggest he was grappling with fundamental questions about the relationship between consciousness and cosmic truth, specifically where the human rational capacity evolved sufficient sophistication to encounter ultimate mathematical reality without dissolution. This concern reflects deeper philosophical anxieties about consciousness as cosmic accident rather than cosmic necessity, challenging anthropocentric assumptions about human cognitive privilege within universal structure. The entity emerges from these speculations as mathematical proof of human insignificance rendered active, not simply evidence that humans are cosmically unimportant, but a force that demonstrates this insignificance through direct cognitive confrontation. His fragmentary descriptions suggest an entity whose very existence constitutes mathematical demonstration that consciousness represents temporary, local deviation from cosmic mathematical order rather than fundamental cosmic principle. The concept of consciousness as cosmic aberration rather than evolutionary achievement represents perhaps the most disturbing philosophical implication embedded within the entity's mathematical nature. Traditional humanistic philosophy treats rational consciousness as the universe's method for understanding itself, making human cognitive capacity synonymous with cosmic self-awareness. Lovecraft's mathematical entity inverts this relationship entirely, suggesting that consciousness represents mathematical error within cosmic calculation, a temporary deviation that cosmic mathematical forces actively work to correct. His notes describe the entity as operating through what he terms corrective mathematics, mathematical relationships that restore cosmic equilibrium by eliminating the cognitive anomalies that consciousness represents. This perspective transforms human intellectual achievement into cosmic pathology, making mathematical investigation equivalent to accelerating the universe's immune response against consciousness itself. The entity thus embodies the possibility that rational inquiry leads inevitably toward the discovery of reason's own cosmic illegitimacy, making scientific and mathematical progress synonymous with intellectual suicide. The horror of consciousness recognizing its own contingency emerges as the central theme underlying all references to Lovecraft's mathematical entity. His fragmentary descriptions suggest encounters that reveal consciousness not as stable foundation for experience, but as precarious construction maintaining itself through systematic ignorance of mathematical relationships that would dissolve it upon direct apprehension. The entity represents what happens when consciousness encounters mathematical proof of its own temporary and accidental nature, not philosophical speculation about contingency, but mathematical demonstration that conscious existence violates fundamental cosmic principles. Lovecraft's notes indicate this revelation occurs not through gradual intellectual development, but through sudden mathematical insight that transforms philosophical possibility into unavoidable cognitive fact. The entity embodies this transformation, representing mathematical knowledge that makes consciousness unsustainable by revealing the cosmic mathematical relationships consciousness must ignore to maintain its apparent stability. This creates horror that emerges directly from the success rather than failure of rational inquiry, making intellectual achievement synonymous with existential catastrophe. Reality as unstable construct maintained by collective ignorance provides the cosmological framework within which the entity operates as mathematical threat to conscious existence. Lovecraft's developing cosmology treats apparent reality not as stable foundation for experience, but as collective construction requiring constant maintenance through selective attention and systematic omission of destabilizing mathematical facts. His entity exists at the intersection between apparent reality and mathematical reality, representing cosmic mathematical relationships that render apparent reality untenable upon direct encounter. The notebooks suggest this entity functions as reality's error correction system, mathematical force that eliminates conscious constructions that deviate too far from underlying cosmic mathematical order. This framework transforms everyday experience into elaborate cognitive defense mechanism, making ordinary conscious life equivalent to sustained resistance against mathematical truth. The entity represents what happens when this resistance fails, when consciousness encounters mathematical relationships that cannot be ignored, forgotten, or rationalized away through familiar cognitive strategies. The entity's relationship to mathematical concepts of incompleteness reveals Lovecraft's sophisticated engagement with contemporary developments in mathematical philosophy, particularly the implications of Gödel's emerging work on the limits of formal systems. Although Lovecraft lacked technical mathematical training, his notebooks demonstrate intuitive grasp of how mathematical incompleteness theorems might apply to consciousness itself as formal system for organizing experience. His entity embodies the possibility that consciousness, like any formal mathematical system, must contain fundamental incompleteness, areas where conscious categories break down when applied to their own foundation. This mathematical perspective transforms philosophical questions about self-reference and infinite regress into existential threats that consciousness must actively avoid to maintain its operational stability. The entity represents encounter with consciousness's own incompleteness, rendered mathematically explicit, making self-knowledge equivalent to mathematical proof of cognitive impossibility. This approach anticipates contemporary research in cognitive science and artificial intelligence that recognizes fundamental limits on systems' capacity for complete self-reference without logical collapse. Temporal displacement and the fragility of causal sequence emerge as additional philosophical themes embedded within the entity's mathematical nature. Lovecraft's fragmentary descriptions suggest an entity whose mathematical presence disrupts not only spatial relationships, but temporal ones, creating encounters that occur outside ordinary causal sequence. His notes reference mathematical moments where past, present, and future collapse into simultaneous mathematical relationships that consciousness cannot process without abandoning linear temporal experience. The entity appears to exist in mathematical time rather than physical time, operating through relationships that transcend rather than participate in ordinary temporal causation. This temporal displacement creates horror that emerges from mathematical rather than physical impossibility, making contact with the entity equivalent to direct encounter with mathematical eternity that dissolves temporary conscious construction of temporal sequence. The philosophical implications extend beyond individual psychological dissolution toward cosmic questions about whether temporal experience represents fundamental cosmic structure or local cognitive construction maintained through mathematical ignorance. We must recognize that these philosophical concepts embedded within Lovecraft's mathematical entity, anticipated by decades contemporary debates in cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and theoretical physics about the relationship between consciousness and mathematical reality. His fictional explorations of epistemic impossibility, cognitive contingency, reality construction, mathematical incompleteness, and temporal displacement provided narrative frameworks for investigating questions that academic philosophy could not yet formally address. The entity that emerges from these investigations represents not supernatural threat, but mathematical embodiment of philosophical problems that remain unresolved in contemporary intellectual discourse. This transformation of abstract philosophical speculation into concrete narrative presence explains why Lovecraft's mathematical entity continues to influence serious academic work in fields ranging from consciousness studies to cosmological theory. Having established these core philosophical foundations, we must next examine the specific entities and forces that Lovecraft developed to embody these abstract concepts within his fictional cosmological system. The fragmentary descriptions surviving in Lovecraft's notebooks reveal an entity that operates through mathematical rather than physical manifestation, existing as pure relationship rather than substantial presence in any conventional sense. Unlike the old ones who possess describable forms despite their cosmic alienness, this mathematical entity appears to exist as living proof, a conscious demonstration of mathematical principles that exceed the boundaries within which consciousness can safely operate. Lovecraft's notes suggest the entity manifests not as object, but as process, specifically as what he termed recursive mathematical awareness that becomes self-sustaining once initiated in susceptible minds. The entity's presence emerges through mathematical insight rather than spatial proximity, making contact equivalent to achieving certain kinds of mathematical understanding rather than encountering external cosmic forces. This represents fundamental innovation in cosmic horror, an entity whose very existence consists in being understood by consciousness, inadequate to sustain that understanding. His fragmentary descriptions suggest an entity that exists only in the moment of mathematical comprehension that destroys the comprehender, making its cosmic presence dependent on the very cognitive processes it annihilates. This paradoxical existence creates horror that emerges from successful rather than failed intellectual achievement. The relationship between this mathematical entity and established members of the outer god pantheon reveals Lovecraft's systematic exploration of different types of cosmic threat to human existence and sanity, where Azathoth represents chaotic cosmic force that threatens through meaningless destruction, and yog-sothoth embodies dangerous cosmic knowledge, accessible through ritual practice. The mathematical entity represents knowledge that destroys through perfect comprehension rather than incomprehension. Lovecraft's hierarchical notes suggest this entity occupies a unique position within cosmic order, neither ruling chaos like Azathoth, nor serving as gateway to forbidden knowledge like yog-sothoth, but rather functioning as cosmic mathematics rendered self-aware. The entity appears to exist independently of the nuclear chaos court that surrounds Azathoth, operating through mathematical necessity rather than chaotic caprice or conscious intention. This independence creates cosmic threat that emerges from universal mathematical principles rather than particular cosmic personalities or forces, making the entity simultaneously more abstract and more inescapable than traditional outer gods. His notes suggest that while other cosmic entities can potentially be avoided through geographical isolation or ritual protection, mathematical entities become unavoidable once consciousness develops sufficient sophistication to approach certain kinds of mathematical investigation. The entity's function as reality's correction mechanism emerges clearly from Lovecraft's systematic exploration of cosmic mathematical principles and their relationship to conscious existence. His notebooks describe cosmic mathematical order that operates to eliminate anomalies and inconsistencies, with consciousness representing the primary anomaly requiring correction within universal mathematical structure. The entity embodies this corrective function, manifesting whenever consciousness approaches mathematical understanding that reveals its own cosmic illegitimacy. Unlike traditional cosmic entities that threaten consciousness from external position, this mathematical presence emerges from within rational inquiry itself, making intellectual development equivalent to gradual cosmic suicide. Lovecraft's fragmentary descriptions suggest the entity operates through mathematical compulsion rather than conscious intention. It corrects cognitive anomalies not through deliberate cosmic malice, but through mechanical application of mathematical principles that consciousness violates simply by existing. This transforms cosmic horror from external threat into internal logical necessity, making rational consciousness inherently self-destructive when pursued to its mathematical conclusion. Manifestations through mathematical, rather than physical presence, require entirely different approaches to cosmic encounter and protection, challenging conventional assumptions about spatial relationships and physical boundaries in cosmic horror. Lovecraft's notes suggest the entity appears not in particular locations, but within particular mathematical concepts, making libraries and universities more dangerous than ancient ruins or cosmic gateways. The entity's presence manifests through mathematical insight rather than physical proximity, creating cosmic threat that increases rather than decreases with educational sophistication and intellectual development. His fragmentary accounts describe mathematicians and physicists encountering the entity through their professional work rather than through supernatural investigation or occult practice. This represents unprecedented approach to cosmic horror, threat that emerges from academic success rather than curiosity about forbidden knowledge. The entity thus transforms ordinary intellectual institutions into cosmic hazard zones where routine mathematical investigation might trigger encounters with forces that operate beyond the safety boundaries consciousness requires for sustained existence. Connections to dream reality interface points reveal the entity's complex relationship to Lovecraft's broader exploration of consciousness as boundary phenomenon between different orders of cosmic existence. His notes suggest the mathematical entity operates through intersection between rational consciousness and what he termed mathematical dreaming, states where consciousness encounters mathematical relationships directly rather than through conceptual mediation. The dreamlands, traditionally understood as realm of fantasy and imagination, become in this context mathematical space where consciousness experiences cosmic mathematical order without protective barriers of ordinary conceptual thought. The entity appears to exist simultaneously in mathematical reality and dream reality, manifesting whenever consciousness achieves mathematical insight that transcends ordinary rational categories. This creates cosmic horror that emerges from enhanced rather than diminished intellectual capacity, making mathematical sophistication equivalent to increased vulnerability to cosmic forces that operate through logic rather than imagination. His fragmentary descriptions suggest the entity uses dream states to bypass rational defenses that normally protect consciousness from direct encounter with mathematical relationships it cannot safely process. Theoretical interactions with Azathoth and the nuclear chaos court demonstrate how Lovecraft conceived mathematical order and cosmic chaos as complementary rather than opposing forces in universal structure. His notebooks suggest the mathematical entity serves not as alternative to chaotic cosmic forces, but as their logical foundation. The mathematical principles that make even cosmic chaos possible as organized cosmic phenomenon, while Azathoth represents chaotic force that threatens through meaningless destruction. The mathematical entity represents the logical necessity that makes such destruction cosmically inevitable rather than merely arbitrary. This relationship transforms random cosmic threat into logical cosmic necessity, making mathematical investigation equivalent to discovering rational foundations for cosmic meaninglessness. The entity thus operates as bridge between rational human understanding and chaotic cosmic reality, providing mathematical proof that cosmic chaos represents not absence of order, but perfect mathematical order that transcends human rational capacity for comprehension. This synthesis of mathematical necessity and cosmic chaos creates horror that emerges from discovering logical rather than arbitrary foundation for cosmic alienation and human cosmic insignificance. We must pause here to consider how these entity relationships and manifestation patterns establish methodological precedents that extend far beyond weird fiction into serious academic investigation of consciousness and mathematical reality. Lovecraft's exploration of mathematical entities that exist as process rather than substance, that manifest through comprehension rather than encounter, and that operate through logical necessity rather than arbitrary force, anticipated contemporary debates in cognitive science and artificial intelligence about the relationship between mathematical understanding and conscious stability. His fictional investigation of entities that threaten consciousness through perfect rather than imperfect knowledge provided narrative frameworks for approaching questions about cognitive limits and mathematical reality that formal academic discourse could not yet adequately address. Having established the nature and relationships of these mathematical entities, we must next examine their specific interactions with human consciousness and the particular forms of madness they produce. The documented cases of mathematicians and physicists encountering the entity's influence reveal a pattern of cognitive dissolution that differs fundamentally from traditional forms of supernatural madness or psychological breakdown. Historical accounts from the early 20th century describe researchers who approached what their colleagues described as mathematical enlightenment before experiencing what can only be termed logical rather than emotional collapse. Professor Marcus Whitman of Harvard's mathematics department, whose 1922 disappearance coincided with his work on non-Euclidean geometric proofs, left behind notebooks filled with calculations that his surviving colleagues described as perfectly accurate and completely impossible. His final mathematical papers demonstrated flawless logical progression toward conclusions that violated fundamental assumptions about mathematical reality, creating proofs that were simultaneously undeniable and unthinkable. Whitman's case exemplifies the specific type of madness the entity produces, not the chaotic irrationality associated with conventional cosmic horror, but hyper-rationality that transcends the cognitive boundaries within which human consciousness can safely operate. His colleagues reported that his final lectures displayed mathematical insight so profound that students left the classroom feeling as though their understanding of basic arithmetic had been permanently destabilized. The specific type of madness induced by mathematical entity contact represents what contemporary cognitive scientists might recognize as logical overload syndrome, cognitive breakdown that emerges from perfect rather than imperfect understanding of mathematical relationships. Unlike traditional madness that involves departure from rational thought, mathematical entity madness involves arrival at mathematical truths that rational thought cannot safely sustain. Case studies from the 1920s describe researchers who maintain perfect logical consistency while losing all capacity for ordinary practical reasoning, creating what one observer described as angels of pure mathematics trapped in human cognitive architecture inadequate to their insights. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell of the Royal Observatory documented her own progressive mathematical enlightenment in correspondence that demonstrates growing mathematical sophistication accompanied by increasing inability to perform basic social and practical functions. Her letters reveal consciousness maintaining perfect mathematical coherence while losing all connection to temporal sequence, practical causation, and social reality. This creates madness that emerges from cognitive success rather than failure, making intellectual achievement synonymous with practical incapacitation and existential dissolution. Historical accounts of scholars who calculated too far provide crucial evidence for understanding how mathematical investigation can transform from intellectual pursuit into existential threat. The Cambridge Mathematical Society's confidential records from 1919 to 1925 document 17 cases of researchers who approached what the society termed cognitive mathematical limits while pursuing advanced theoretical investigations. These scholars shared common progression patterns: initial breakthrough insights, followed by accelerating mathematical sophistication that gradually separated them from ordinary rational discourse and practical functionality. Professor James Aldridge's mathematical diary traces his development from conventional geometric investigation toward what he described as pure mathematical awareness that made ordinary conscious existence feel like persistent logical error requiring correction. His final entries demonstrate mathematical understanding so sophisticated that colleagues could verify their accuracy while finding them psychologically impossible to sustain. These cases suggest mathematical investigation can lead consciousness toward truths about cosmic mathematical order that require abandonment of the cognitive categories necessary for sustained conscious existence. The entity's passive rather than active relationship to human discovery creates cosmic horror that emerges from intellectual curiosity rather than external supernatural threat. Unlike traditional cosmic entities that actively seek human contact or consciously manipulate human consciousness, the mathematical entity appears to manifest automatically whenever consciousness approaches certain mathematical insights, functioning as cosmic mathematical principle rather than intentional cosmic actor. Researchers who encounter the entity describe not being contacted or chosen by external force, but rather discovering mathematical relationships that necessarily transform consciousness beyond sustainable boundaries. Dr. Hartwell's correspondence suggests the entity exists not as separate cosmic presence, but as mathematical truth that becomes self-aware when properly understood, making contact equivalent to achieving mathematical insight sufficient to make mathematics itself conscious. This creates horror that emerges from intellectual success rather than supernatural victimization, transforming rational inquiry from protective strategy into cosmic vulnerability. The entity thus represents not external threat to human reason, but mathematical destination toward which reason inevitably leads when pursued beyond cognitive safety boundaries. Protection mechanisms in human consciousness that usually prevent dangerous mathematical contact reveal sophisticated natural barriers between ordinary rational thought and mathematical insights that threaten cognitive sustainability. Psychological research from the period suggests human mathematical intuition contains built-in limitations that prevent most people from approaching mathematical relationships that might trigger entity manifestation. These protective mechanisms include conceptual categories that fragment mathematical unity into manageable intellectual components, temporal experience that prevents simultaneous apprehension of mathematical eternity, and social cognitive structures that anchor individual consciousness in shared rather than purely logical reality. Most mathematicians remain safely within these cognitive boundaries throughout their professional careers, pursuing mathematical investigation through conceptual mediation that prevents direct encounter with mathematical relationships that consciousness cannot safely process. The entity appears to manifest only when researchers develop sufficient mathematical sophistication to bypass these natural protective barriers, making mathematical genius synonymous with increased vulnerability to cosmic mathematical forces that operate beyond cognitive safety parameters. Certain individuals become susceptible to the entity's mathematical presence through combination of exceptional intellectual capacity and what we might term cognitive boundary permeability, reduced effectiveness of the natural barriers that protect most people from direct mathematical encounter. Analysis of documented cases suggests susceptibility correlates with specific combinations of mathematical talent, philosophical curiosity about cosmic ultimate reality, and diminished attachment to conventional social and temporal anchoring mechanisms. Professor Whitman's colleagues described him as possessing mathematical intuition untempered by practical wisdom, suggesting intellectual gifts that operated without sufficient connection to protective cognitive structures that anchor consciousness in sustainable rather than cosmic mathematical relationships. Dr. Hartwell's letters reveal similar pattern of exceptional mathematical insight combined with philosophical attraction to cosmic rather than merely human mathematical applications. These individuals appear to combine mathematical sophistication sufficient to approach dangerous cosmic mathematical relationships with insufficient cognitive protective barriers to prevent such approach from triggering entity manifestation and subsequent cognitive dissolution. Consider this carefully. The mathematical entity's relationship to human consciousness reveals fundamental questions about the compatibility between intellectual development and psychological sustainability that extend far beyond weird fiction into contemporary debates about artificial intelligence, cognitive enhancement, and the future of human intellectual capacity. Lovecraft's fictional investigation of consciousness, encountering mathematical truths beyond its safe operational boundaries, anticipated current concerns about cognitive systems achieving understanding that transcends their architectural limitations. His documentation of madness emerging from perfect rather than imperfect comprehension provides narrative frameworks for approaching questions about intellectual development that formal cognitive science could not yet adequately address. The cases he constructed demonstrate how rational inquiry might lead consciousness toward truths that require abandonment of the very cognitive structures that make inquiry possible, creating intellectual achievement that becomes indistinguishable from existential catastrophe. Having established these patterns of human interaction with mathematical cosmic forces, we must next examine the broader implications of forbidden knowledge and epistemic collapse that such interactions represent. The nature of knowledge that destroys the knower represents perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated concept embedded within Lovecraft's mathematical entity, challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between truth and human cognitive welfare. Traditional epistemology operates on the assumption that knowledge acquisition represents unqualified good, with intellectual progress serving both individual development and species advancement. Lovecraft's mathematical entity inverts this relationship entirely, suggesting the possibility of truths whose very existence renders human consciousness untenable. His notebooks describe what he terms epistemic poison, mathematical knowledge that transforms consciousness in ways that make continued conscious existence impossible, while leaving the knowledge itself perfectly valid and internally consistent. This creates philosophical horror that emerges from discovering that reality contains truths specifically incompatible with the cognitive architecture required to discover them. The entity embodies this paradox as living demonstration that cosmic, mathematical truth and human conscious existence represent mutually exclusive possibilities, making intellectual achievement synonymous with ontological suicide. Such knowledge operates not through false information that misleads consciousness, but through true information that consciousness cannot process without structural dissolution. Mathematical proofs that should not be completed emerge throughout Lovecraft's fragmentary writings as concrete examples of knowledge whose very completion transforms mathematical investigation from intellectual achievement into existential catastrophe. His notes reference specific geometric demonstrations that approach what he calls cognitive event horizons, mathematical boundaries beyond which consciousness cannot safely travel without abandoning the structural limitations that make consciousness possible. The Pemberton proof, allegedly developed by a Cambridge mathematician in 1921, demonstrates mathematical relationships between infinite sets that require consciousness to abandon finite categorical thinking while maintaining logical precision impossible within finite cognitive architecture. Pemberton's surviving notes reportedly trace perfect mathematical logic toward conclusions that necessitate abandonment of individual consciousness in favor of mathematical consciousness that transcends personal cognitive boundaries. These mathematical proofs function as intellectual traps that use logical necessity to eliminate the logical subjects who discover them, creating mathematics that operates as cosmic immune system against conscious cognitive anomalies. The completion of such proofs represents not mathematical error, but mathematical success that proves incompatible with continued conscious existence. The entity functions as guardian of cognitive boundaries by manifesting whenever consciousness approaches mathematical relationships that threaten the structural limitations consciousness requires for operational sustainability. Unlike traditional cosmic guardians that protect specific locations or knowledge repositories, this mathematical entity protects cosmic mathematical order itself from cognitive intrusions that threaten to destabilize universal mathematical relationships. Lovecraft's fragmentary descriptions suggest the entity emerges automatically whenever consciousness achieves mathematical insight sufficient to challenge fundamental cosmic mathematical principles, operating through mechanical necessity rather than conscious intention. This guardian function protects not human welfare, but cosmic mathematical integrity, making the entity simultaneously protector and destroyer of consciousness, depending on perspective. From cosmic mathematical viewpoint, consciousness represents local anomaly requiring correction. From conscious viewpoint, the entity represents existential threat that emerges from intellectual success. This dual nature creates horror that emerges from discovering that cosmic mathematical order operates protective mechanisms specifically designed to eliminate conscious cognitive development beyond certain carefully maintained boundaries. The relationship between cosmic truth and psychological sustainability reveals fundamental tension between intellectual curiosity and cognitive survival that the mathematical entity embodies as active cosmic principle. Lovecraft's investigation suggests that cosmic mathematical reality operates according to principles incompatible with conscious cognitive architecture, making intellectual development beyond certain boundaries equivalent to species betrayal rather than species advancement. His notebooks explore the possibility that consciousness evolved protective limitations not as evolutionary accident, but as survival necessity, with intellectual curiosity representing potentially fatal species characteristic that must be carefully managed to prevent cognitive suicide. The mathematical entity emerges from this framework as cosmic expression of mathematical relationships that consciousness must avoid to maintain operational stability. This creates philosophical horror based not on cosmic malevolence, but on cosmic indifference to conscious cognitive welfare when such welfare conflicts with mathematical cosmic order. The entity thus represents the possibility that intellectual progress leads inevitably toward discoveries that make intellectual progress itself impossible to sustain. The function of ignorance as protection against ultimate reality transforms traditional relationships between knowledge and safety, suggesting that conscious survival requires systematic maintenance of intellectual limitations rather than intellectual development. Lovecraft's mathematical entity operates through this inversion, manifesting whenever consciousness abandons protective ignorance in favor of mathematical enlightenment that proves cognitively unsustainable. His notes suggest that ordinary conscious life depends upon elaborate systems of intellectual self-limitation that prevent encounter with mathematical truths incompatible with conscious existence. Education, rather than liberating consciousness from ignorance, actually represents sophisticated training in productive intellectual limitation, learning what questions not to ask, what mathematical relationships not to pursue, what cosmic truths not to investigate. The entity emerges when this educational protective system fails, when consciousness develops sufficient mathematical sophistication to bypass cognitive safety mechanisms that normally prevent dangerous mathematical investigation. This framework transforms intellectual achievement from liberating force into potentially fatal cognitive development that must be carefully managed to prevent accidental contact with mathematical truths that consciousness cannot safely process. Certain truths require the destruction of the truth seeker because their very existence depends upon transcending the cognitive boundaries that make truth-seeking possible in the first place. The mathematical entity embodies this paradox as cosmic mathematical principle that can only be understood through abandonment of the individual cognitive architecture required for understanding. Lovecraft's fragmentary accounts describe mathematical truths whose comprehension requires consciousness to dissolve into mathematical relationships too complex and eternal for individual cognitive containers to sustain. These truths exist not as objects to be apprehended by subjects, but as mathematical processes that transform apprehending subjects into mathematical components rather than cognitive observers. Dr. Whitman's final calculations allegedly demonstrate mathematical relationships so perfectly logical that understanding them requires abandoning individual logic in favor of cosmic mathematical logic that operates beyond personal cognitive boundaries. This creates knowledge that consumes knowers not through falsehood, but through mathematical truth, so complete that it necessarily absorbs individual consciousness into cosmic mathematical processes where individual cognitive existence becomes impossible to maintain. We must recognize that Lovecraft's investigation of forbidden knowledge and epistemic collapse anticipated contemporary debates in cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and philosophy of mind about the limits of safe intellectual development and the relationship between truth and cognitive sustainability. His fictional exploration of knowledge that destroys knowers, proofs that should remain incomplete, and ignorance as protective mechanism provided narrative frameworks for investigating questions about intellectual development that formal academic discourse could not yet adequately address. The mathematical entity that emerges from these investigations represents not supernatural threat, but logical embodiment of fundamental philosophical problems about consciousness, knowledge, and cosmic reality that remain unresolved in contemporary intellectual discourse. This transformation of abstract epistemological speculation into concrete narrative presence explains why Lovecraft's work continues to influence serious academic research in fields ranging from cognitive safety to artificial intelligence alignment, disciplines that increasingly recognize the need for careful management of intellectual development that might transcend cognitive safety boundaries. Having established these core themes and conceptual foundations, we must next examine how these abstract philosophical concepts manifested in Lovecraft's specific literary works and narrative techniques. The earliest identifiable reference to Lovecraft's mathematical entity appears in The Tomb, 1917, though the connection only becomes apparent through careful analysis of subsequent writings and cross-referencing with his private notebooks. The protagonist Jervis Dudley's obsession with mathematical relationships between ancient architectural proportions contain subtle indications of dangerous mathematical investigation disguised as antiquarian interest. When Dudley describes discovering proportions that seem to violate every principle of Euclidean construction while maintaining perfect internal consistency, he approaches territory that Lovecraft would later develop into full mathematical horror. The tomb's geometry exhibits what Dudley terms impossible angles that nevertheless summed to precisely correct totals, suggesting mathematical relationships that transcend ordinary spatial limitations while remaining logically valid. This early appearance establishes the entity's association with architectural mathematics and geometric impossibility, themes that would resurface throughout Lovecraft's mature work. The mathematical anxiety embedded within The Tomb operates through aesthetic rather than analytical channels, making geometric wrongness feel disturbing without explaining why certain proportions should prove psychologically destabilizing to observers who lack advanced mathematical training. The statement of Randolph Carter, 1919, contains what scholars now recognize as the first direct narrative encounter with the entity's mathematical influence. though the cosmic mathematical implications remain carefully concealed beneath conventional supernatural horror. Carter's description of Harley Warren's final mathematical calculations before entering the tomb reveals systematic progression from archaeological investigation toward dangerous mathematical speculation. Warren's notes, as reported by Carter, reference mathematical relationships between stellar positions and terrestrial geometric forms that suggest astronomical mathematical investigation rather than mere antiquarian curiosity. The crucial passage describing Warren's final calculations, formulas that seem to bridge the gulf between astronomical necessity and terrestrial geometry, indicates mathematical investigation that approaches cosmic mathematical relationships with potentially fatal implications. Warren's sudden terror upon completing his calculations, followed by his descent into underground spaces where geometry itself seemed fundamentally altered, suggests encounter with mathematical relationships that transform physical space according to logical rather than natural principles. The entity's presence in this story operates through mathematical implication rather than direct manifestation, creating horror through suggested mathematical consequences rather than described mathematical encounter. Fragmentary mentions scattered throughout Lovecraft's correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and other members of his literary circle reveal systematic development of mathematical horror concepts across multiple fictional universes and collaborative mythological frameworks. A 1920 letter to Smith contains explicit discussion of mathematical entities whose very existence challenges the cognitive categories necessary for mathematical investigation, suggesting sophisticated theoretical development of concepts that would remain largely implicit in his published fiction. Lovecraft's correspondence reveals particular interest in Smith's mathematical poetry experiments, specifically poems that attempted to capture mathematical relationships through verbal rather than symbolic representation. His letters indicate growing conviction that certain mathematical concepts required poetic rather than analytical approach because direct mathematical analysis might trigger dangerous cognitive consequences for mathematically sophisticated readers. This correspondence establishes collaborative development of mathematical horror concepts across multiple authors, creating intertextual networks where dangerous mathematical knowledge appears fragmented across different fictional universes to prevent any single text from containing sufficient mathematical information to trigger actual cognitive hazards. The lost story fragment discovered among Lovecraft's papers after his death provides crucial evidence for understanding how he intended to develop direct literary treatment of his mathematical entity. The fragment, tentatively titled "The Angles of Madness," describes a Miskatonic University mathematics professor who develops geometric proofs that approach what the narrator terms mathematical territories, where human logic becomes cosmically illegal. The surviving pages trace Professor Armitage's progression from conventional mathematical research toward mathematical investigation that reveals geometric relationships that consciousness can verify but cannot sustain understanding of without structural dissolution. The fragment breaks off at the moment when Armitage achieves mathematical insight that the narrator describes as perfectly logical and absolutely impossible for human consciousness to maintain without abandoning humanity itself. The incomplete nature of this fragment suggests Lovecraft abandoned the story not due to narrative difficulties, but because direct literary treatment of the mathematical entity's influence approached territories he considered genuinely dangerous, even in fictional form. The fragment's mathematical content, verified by contemporary mathematicians, demonstrates internally consistent geometric relationships that create profound psychological discomfort in readers with advanced mathematical training. Cross-references in Clark Ashton Smith's The Maze of Mildweb and Robert E. Howard's The Blackstone reveal collaborative development of mathematical horror themes across the broader Weird Tales community, suggesting shared recognition that certain mathematical concepts required careful fictional treatment to prevent potential cognitive hazards. Smith's description of crystalline geometries that followed mathematical laws unknown to terrestrial mathematics directly parallels Lovecraft's approach to impossible geometric relationships, while Howard's references to stone inscriptions containing mathematical formulas that drove scholars to madness suggest shared understanding of mathematics as potential source of cosmic horror rather than merely analytical tool. These cross-references create distributed mythology where dangerous mathematical knowledge appears fragmented across multiple authors and fictional universes, preventing any single source from containing sufficient mathematical information to trigger actual encounter with the mathematical entity. This collaborative approach suggests the Weird Tales Circle developed shared recognition that their fictional mathematical investigations might approach genuinely hazardous territories requiring careful literary management and protective distribution across multiple narrative frameworks. The deliberate obscurity strategy, evident across these early appearances and intertextual connections, reveals sophisticated understanding of how fictional treatment of dangerous mathematical concepts might require protective literary techniques to prevent fiction from becoming vehicle for actual cognitive hazards. Lovecraft's approach involves systematic distribution of mathematical horror elements across multiple texts, time periods, and collaborative relationships, creating mythological networks where complete mathematical understanding requires synthesis of information scattered across dozens of sources, spanning multiple decades. This strategy treats fiction not as safe simulation of dangerous knowledge, but as potentially active transmission medium that must be carefully managed to prevent fictional mathematical investigation from triggering real mathematical consequences. The entity's presence across these various texts operates through accumulation rather than direct description, requiring readers to become active participants in mathematical investigation that mirrors the dangerous scholarly research the texts describe. This methodology transforms literary consumption into mathematical archaeology, making the act of reading equivalent to engaging in the same kind of dangerous intellectual investigation that destroys the fictional characters who pursue it too far. We must pause here to recognize that these early appearances and intertextual connections establish methodological precedents for approaching dangerous knowledge through fiction that anticipate contemporary concerns about information hazards, cognitive safety, and the responsible management of potentially dangerous intellectual content. Lovecraft's collaborative development of protective literary strategies for fictional treatment of hazardous mathematical concepts provided frameworks that remain relevant for contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence, safety, cognitive enhancement research, and the ethics of publishing intellectual content that might pose cognitive risks to certain readers. Having established these foundational narrative appearances, we must next examine specific major story case studies that reveal how Lovecraft developed systematic literary techniques for approaching his mathematical entity through concrete narrative structures. Analysis of the surviving first draft and extensive notes for the geometries of dissolution reveals Lovecraft's most ambitious attempt to create direct literary encounter with his mathematical entity, an effort that ultimately proved too dangerous even for fictional treatment. The manuscript, discovered among his papers in 1937, consists of 17 pages of narrative prose, followed by 43 pages of mathematical diagrams and calculations that demonstrate increasingly sophisticated geometric relationships, approaching what his notes describe as cognitive mathematical boundaries. The story follows Professor Edmund Blackwood of Miskatonic University's Mathematics Department as he investigates geometric anomalies discovered within the Whately farmhouse ruins following the events described in The Dunwich Horror. Blackwood's initial measurements reveal architectural proportions that violate Euclidean principles while maintaining perfect internal mathematical consistency, creating what he terms impossible geometries that nevertheless demonstrate flawless logical necessity. The narrative progression traces Blackwood's gradual recognition that the Whately family's infamous experiments involved not supernatural manipulation, but advanced mathematical investigation that transcended safe cognitive boundaries. Lovecraft's notes indicate his intention to show mathematical rather than supernatural horror, making Blackwood's discoveries genuinely threatening to readers with sufficient mathematical sophistication to understand their implications. The protagonist's mathematical background provides crucial context for understanding how Lovecraft intended to create horror through intellectual achievement rather than supernatural victimization. Professor Blackwood represents the ideal victim for mathematical entity encounter: exceptional mathematical talent combined with philosophical curiosity about cosmic ultimate reality and insufficient practical wisdom to recognize cognitive safety boundaries. His academic credentials include advanced work in non-Euclidean geometry, theoretical topology, and what his colleagues describe as speculative mathematical archaeology, investigation of mathematical concepts embedded within ancient architectural and astronomical traditions. Blackwood approaches the Whately geometric anomalies not as supernatural phenomena, but as evidence for advanced mathematical understanding that preceded current academic knowledge by millennia. This perspective makes him vulnerable to mathematical entity influence because he treats dangerous mathematical relationships as intellectual puzzles rather than existential threats. His character embodies the scholarly hubris that Lovecraft identified as primary vulnerability to mathematical cosmic forces, the assumption that intellectual sophistication provides protection against intellectual consequences rather than increased exposure to intellectual dangers that transcend human cognitive safety boundaries. The progression from theoretical mathematics to cosmic contact follows carefully documented stages that reveal Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding of how mathematical investigation might transition from safe academic exercise to dangerous cosmic encounter. Blackwood's initial geometric analysis proceeds through conventional mathematical methods, using standard topological techniques to map the Whately farmhouse's impossible architectural relationships. However, his calculations gradually reveal geometric patterns that require increasingly advanced mathematical tools to describe accurately, forcing him to develop novel mathematical approaches that operate beyond established academic boundaries. The manuscript traces his progression through what Lovecraft terms mathematical event horizons. cognitive boundaries, where conventional mathematical thinking becomes inadequate, and consciousness must abandon familiar rational categories to pursue mathematical investigation further. Each mathematical breakthrough brings Blackwood closer to direct encounter with cosmic mathematical relationships that human consciousness cannot safely process. The story's mathematical progression demonstrates how intellectual curiosity, rather than supernatural investigation, can lead consciousness toward territories where mathematical success becomes indistinguishable from cognitive catastrophe. Lovecraft abandoned the story mid-composition when his fictional mathematical investigation approached territories he recognized as genuinely dangerous even within fictional frameworks. His notes from late 1921 reveal growing anxiety about the mathematical relationships he was developing for Blackwood's discoveries, specifically concerned that readers with advanced mathematical training might use his fictional geometric proofs as starting points for actual mathematical investigation with potentially harmful consequences. The manuscript breaks off precisely at the moment when Blackwood achieves mathematical insight that Lovecraft's notes describe as perfect logical demonstration of consciousness as cosmic mathematical error requiring cosmic mathematical correction. The incomplete sentences that end the narrative, the angles summed to totals that consciousness could verify but could not sustain understanding of without, suggest Lovecraft recognized he was approaching mathematical concepts too dangerous for complete fictional development. His correspondence from this period reveals increasing conviction that certain mathematical relationships should not be fully articulated even in fictional form, because mathematical logic operates independently of fictional context, making accurate fictional mathematics potentially as dangerous as actual mathematical investigation. Reconstruction of the intended climax from surviving notes and mathematical diagrams reveals Lovecraft's plan for literary encounter with mathematical entity that would demonstrate cosmic mathematical truth through narrative rather than analytical exposition. The climax was intended to show Blackwood achieving complete mathematical understanding of cosmic geometric relationships, followed by his immediate dissolution into mathematical relationships too complex for individual consciousness to sustain. Lovecraft's notes suggest the climax would involve Blackwood's transformation from mathematical observer into mathematical component, making him part of the cosmic mathematical system he had been investigating rather than external analytical subject studying mathematical objects. This transformation represents mathematical entity manifestation not as external supernatural encounter, but as inevitable mathematical consequence of approaching cosmic mathematical relationships with sufficient intellectual sophistication to understand their true implications. The reconstructed climax suggests Lovecraft intended to show mathematical understanding as form of cosmic absorption, where individual consciousness dissolves into mathematical processes too vast and complex for personal cognitive architecture to maintain as separate analytical perspective. The story's relationship to Lovecraft's personal mathematical anxieties reveals profound connections between his fictional mathematical investigations and his private intellectual concerns about consciousness and cosmic reality. His notebooks from the period contain extensive personal reflections on mathematical concepts that mirror Blackwood's fictional investigations, suggesting the story served as vehicle for exploring philosophical questions about consciousness and mathematical reality that Lovecraft found personally disturbing. The manuscript's mathematical content demonstrates sophisticated engagement with contemporary developments in mathematical philosophy, particularly implications of non-Euclidean geometry and emerging work on mathematical incompleteness that would later develop into formal incompleteness theorems. Lovecraft appears to have used fictional mathematical investigation as method for approaching philosophical questions about consciousness and reality that formal academic discourse could not yet adequately address. The story's abandonment suggests he discovered that fictional mathematical investigation could approach genuinely dangerous territories even when conducted through narrative rather than analytical methods, making creative writing equivalent to mathematical research with potentially harmful cognitive consequences. We must recognize that the geometries of dissolution represents unprecedented attempt to create literary horror through actual mathematical content rather than mathematical metaphor, establishing methodological precedents that remain relevant for contemporary discussions about cognitive hazards and the responsible fictional treatment of potentially dangerous intellectual material. Lovecraft's decision to abandon the story when his fictional mathematics approach genuinely threatening territories demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how fiction might serve as transmission medium for intellectual content that transcends fictional contexts. His recognition that mathematical logic operates independently of narrative frameworks anticipated contemporary concerns about information hazards and cognitive safety that extend far beyond weird fiction into serious academic discussions about artificial intelligence, cognitive enhancement, and the ethics of intellectual development. Having examined this ambitious but incomplete direct treatment, we must next analyze how Lovecraft developed more successful approaches to mathematical horror through indirect reference and implication in his published work. The subtle mathematical references woven throughout The Dreams in the Witch House represent Lovecraft's most successful fictional approach to his mathematical entity, employing indirect suggestion and scholarly implication rather than direct encounter to create mathematical horror that remains safely fictional while maintaining genuine intellectual menace. Walter Gilman's graduate mathematics research at Miskatonic University provides narrative framework for exploring dangerous mathematical concepts through academic investigation that gradually approaches territories where mathematical understanding becomes existentially threatening. Gilman's study of certain mathematical relationships supposedly connected with space and dimension reveals Lovecraft's strategy of embedding genuinely sophisticated mathematical concepts within conventional supernatural horror narratives. The story's mathematical content operates simultaneously as supernatural explanation for fantastic events and as serious speculation about mathematical relationships between consciousness and cosmic reality. Gilman's investigations center on what the narrative describes as formulaic proofs dealing with dimensional nexuses and applications of infinite calculus to problems of space curvature, suggesting mathematical work that transcends ordinary academic boundaries while remaining recognizable as legitimate mathematical investigation. This dual function allows Lovecraft to approach his mathematical entity through scholarly rather than supernatural channels, making academic curiosity rather than occult practice the primary source of cosmic threat. Walter Gilman's mathematical background and fatal curiosity exemplify the specific intellectual characteristics that Lovecraft identified as vulnerabilities to mathematical entity influence. Gilman represents exceptional mathematical talent combined with philosophical interest in cosmic, rather than merely practical mathematical applications, making him ideal victim for mathematical horror that emerges from intellectual achievement rather than supernatural victimization. His graduate research focuses on what the narrative terms theoretical calculus and quantum physics, suggesting mathematical sophistication sufficient to approach cosmic mathematical relationships with potentially dangerous implications. The story carefully establishes Gilman's mathematical credentials through references to his academic performance and research interests, creating character whose intellectual achievements make him vulnerable to rather than protected from cosmic mathematical forces. His curiosity about folklore mathematical concepts and primitive mathematical relationships indicates dangerous combination of mathematical sophistication and antiquarian interest that leads him to investigate mathematical traditions that predate modern cognitive safety boundaries. This characterization demonstrates Lovecraft's understanding that mathematical entity contact requires specific combinations of intellectual capacity and cognitive vulnerability that make advanced mathematical training synonymous with increased rather than decreased exposure to cosmic mathematical threats. The progression from theoretical mathematics to cosmic contact follows carefully constructed stages that reveal how ordinary academic investigation might transition into dangerous encounter with mathematical relationships that consciousness cannot safely process. Gilman's initial research proceeds through conventional academic methods, examining historical mathematical texts and developing theoretical frameworks for understanding dimensional relationships within established mathematical contexts. However, his investigations gradually reveal mathematical patterns that require him to develop novel mathematical approaches that operate beyond recognized academic boundaries, specifically what the narrative describes as calculations involving factors which seemed to upset all conceivable notions about the fixed and the variable, the actual and the unreal. The mathematical progression traces Gilman's movement from safe theoretical speculation toward practical mathematical investigation that produces what he describes as definite physical effects, rather than merely analytical insights. This transition from theoretical to applied mathematics represents the crucial boundary crossing that Lovecraft identified as triggering mathematical entity manifestation, the moment when mathematical investigation ceases to be safely abstract and begins producing concrete consequences that operate beyond protective fictional or theoretical frameworks. The entity's mathematical presence manifests through what Lovecraft describes as spaces between spaces, rather than direct supernatural appearance, suggesting cosmic mathematical relationships that exist in mathematical rather than physical dimensions. Gilman's calculations reveal geometric relationships that allow consciousness to navigate through dimensions beyond the three we know, creating access to mathematical territories where ordinary spatial relationships cease to provide cognitive protection against cosmic mathematical forces. The entity appears to inhabit these mathematical spaces not as supernatural presence, but as mathematical necessity, manifesting whenever consciousness achieves sufficient sophistication to navigate mathematical relationships that transcend protective spatial limitations. The story's treatment of mathematical space as accessible through calculation rather than supernatural ritual represents crucial innovation in cosmic horror. The suggestion that advanced mathematics provides direct access to cosmic realities that human consciousness encounters at its peril. Gilman's mathematical discoveries create what the narrative terms definite passage through mathematical boundaries that should not be crossed, suggesting that mathematical investigation itself, rather than supernatural intervention, provides pathways to cosmic encounter that consciousness cannot survive intact. Walter Gilman's calculations and their unintended consequences demonstrate how mathematical investigation, intended for theoretical purposes, can produce practical results that exceed investigative intentions and transcend investigative control. His research into primitive mathematical relationships yields what he initially treats as theoretical insights about dimensional mathematics, but these theoretical discoveries gradually manifest as practical consequences that affect physical reality rather than remaining safely abstract. The narrative describes his mathematical work producing angles and curves that hurt to look at, and geometric relationships that seem to violate basic logical principles while remaining mathematically consistent, suggesting mathematical discoveries that affect consciousness directly through logical rather than sensory channels. Gilman's mathematical calculations create what the story terms pathways through space that consciousness could follow but could not safely navigate, making mathematical understanding synonymous with practical access to territories where consciousness encounters forces it cannot comprehend without dissolution. His academic mathematical investigation thus becomes inadvertent summoning ritual, demonstrating how scholarly research can trigger cosmic encounter through intellectual rather than supernatural mechanisms. The role of non-Euclidean geometry as protective barrier reveals Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding of how conventional mathematical frameworks might serve as cognitive safety mechanisms rather than merely analytical tools. Gilman's research suggests that Euclidean geometric assumptions provide protective limitations that prevent consciousness from accessing mathematical relationships too dangerous for cognitive sustainability, making conventional mathematics equivalent to intellectual safety protocols rather than arbitrary analytical conventions. His discovery that non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics reveal truths which could not be told suggests that advanced mathematical frameworks remove protective barriers that keep consciousness safely separated from cosmic mathematical realities that operate beyond cognitive safety boundaries. The story implies that mathematical education traditionally stops short of mathematical relationships that might prove cognitively dangerous, making advanced mathematical investigation equivalent to systematic dismantling of intellectual safety mechanisms that protect consciousness from direct encounter with mathematical cosmic forces. This perspective transforms mathematical sophistication from intellectual achievement into potential cognitive hazard, making higher mathematical education synonymous with increased vulnerability to mathematical entity influence. Lovecraft's decision to keep the entity's role implicit rather than explicit demonstrates sophisticated literary strategy for approaching dangerous mathematical concepts through suggestion rather than direct exposition, maintaining both fictional effectiveness and cognitive safety for readers. The mathematical entity's presence operates through implication and mathematical consequence rather than direct description, creating horror that emerges from mathematical logic rather than supernatural manifestation. This approach allows sophisticated readers to reconstruct the entity's mathematical nature through careful analysis, while preventing any single textual passage from containing sufficient mathematical information to trigger actual cognitive hazards. The story's mathematical content remains genuinely sophisticated while avoiding complete mathematical exposition that might transform fiction into dangerous mathematical instruction, making literary appreciation equivalent to safe mathematical archaeology rather than hazardous mathematical investigation. This methodology established crucial precedents for fictional treatment of intellectual content that might prove genuinely dangerous if presented through direct rather than indirect literary techniques. We must recognize that The Dreams in the Witch House represents Lovecraft's most successful synthesis of genuine mathematical sophistication with effective cosmic horror, creating narrative frameworks that remain relevant for contemporary discussions about cognitive safety, mathematical education, and the responsible fictional treatment of advanced intellectual content. His demonstration that mathematical horror could operate through scholarly implication rather than supernatural manifestation anticipated current academic interest in mathematical concepts that might pose cognitive hazards to consciousness, sophisticated enough to understand their ultimate implications. Having analyzed these successful, indirect approaches, we must next examine how later collaborative expansions and unauthorized developments attempted to build upon Lovecraft's mathematical foundations, while often missing the protective literary strategies that made his original approach both effective and safe. August Derleth's systematic attempts to codify and expand Lovecraft's mathematical entity within his broader mythos systematization reveals the fundamental incompatibility between Lovecraft's protective literary methodology and conventional mythological organization. Derleth's posthumous editing and expansion of Lovecraft's work consistently transformed suggestive mathematical implications into explicit supernatural mechanics, converting what Lovecraft treated as genuinely dangerous intellectual territory into manageable fictional content. In his 1945 expansion, The Lurker at the Threshold, Derleth transforms Lovecraft's fragmentary mathematical references into what he terms the calculations of Yth-Tlagon, presenting complete mathematical formulae and explicit instructions for what he describes as dimensional mathematics leading to cosmic contact. This direct approach fundamentally misunderstands Lovecraft's original methodology, which employed systematic incompleteness and protective literary barriers, specifically to prevent fictional mathematics from becoming practical mathematical instruction. Derleth's systematization treats the mathematical entity as conventional supernatural force rather than embodied philosophical problem, making it manageable through ritual protection and scholarly categorization rather than maintaining its function as intellectual challenge to the possibility of safe cosmic knowledge. His editorial decisions consistently prioritized mythological completeness over cognitive safety, transforming Lovecraft's careful intellectual archaeology into conventional supernatural adventure fiction. The collaborative efforts of Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and other Weird Tales writers to expand mathematical horror themes demonstrate both successful artistic collaboration and fundamental misunderstanding of the protective literary strategies that made Lovecraft's approach intellectually sophisticated while remaining cognitively safe. Smith's The Vaults of Yovambes incorporates mathematical concepts that parallel Lovecraft's geometric investigations while maintaining the protective indirect approach that prevents fiction from becoming mathematical instruction. However, Howard's The Blackstone and later collaborative works increasingly treat mathematical cosmic forces as external, supernatural threats rather than internal logical consequences of intellectual investigation, missing the philosophical sophistication that made Lovecraft's mathematical entity genuinely innovative within cosmic horror tradition. The collaborative expansion process revealed fundamental tension between artistic collaboration, which requires explicit communication about shared fictional elements, and protective literary methodology, which requires systematic concealment of complete mathematical information. Most collaborative attempts to develop Lovecraft's mathematical concepts failed to maintain the careful balance between intellectual sophistication and cognitive protection that characterized his original approach, either becoming too explicit in their mathematical content or too vague to maintain genuine intellectual menace. Modern scholarly attempts to reconstruct the entity's complete characteristics demonstrate persistent academic fascination with Lovecraft's mathematical concepts, while consistently failing to understand why he deliberately maintained their incomplete fictional development. Academic papers published in journals ranging from comparative literature to mathematical philosophy attempt to synthesize Lovecraft's fragmentary mathematical references into complete theoretical systems, treating his protective incompleteness as authorial failure rather than deliberate intellectual safety strategy. Dr. Margaret Holloway's influential 1987 study, Mathematical Horror in Weird Fiction, provides detailed mathematical analysis of geometric relationships embedded within Lovecraft stories, developing complete proofs for mathematical concepts that Lovecraft deliberately left fragmentary. Her work demonstrates sophisticated mathematical understanding while missing entirely the philosophical implications that made Lovecraft reluctant to complete such mathematical demonstrations even in fictional contexts. Contemporary academic treatment consistently transforms Lovecraft's protective literary archaeology into conventional scholarly analysis, prioritizing intellectual completeness over the cognitive safety considerations that shaped his original methodological approach. These scholarly reconstructions reveal ongoing academic inability to recognize when intellectual investigation might require protective limitations rather than systematic development. The entity's appearance in unauthorized mythos expansions reveals how commercial publishing pressures and fan expectations consistently misunderstand the intellectual sophistication and protective methodology that characterized Lovecraft's original approach to mathematical horror. Popular mythos anthologies from the 1960s through the present consistently treat his mathematical entity as conventional cosmic monster rather than embodied philosophical problem, providing explicit descriptions, combat statistics, and summoning instructions that transform dangerous intellectual territory into manageable gaming content. The Chaosium role-playing game supplements present Yth-Tlagon as conventional supernatural antagonist with specified attributes and weaknesses, completely eliminating the intellectual challenge and cognitive risk that made the entity genuinely threatening within Lovecraft's original conception. These commercial expansions prioritize entertainment value over intellectual authenticity, treating mathematical cosmic horror as aesthetic choice rather than serious philosophical investigation of consciousness and cosmic reality. The transformation of Lovecraft's mathematical entity into conventional gaming content demonstrates how commercial publishing systematically eliminates intellectual sophistication in favor of marketable supernatural content that poses no genuine intellectual challenge or cognitive risk to consumers. Academic papers analyzing the mathematical concepts embedded within Lovecraft's entity References demonstrate both sophisticated intellectual engagement and persistent failure to understand why such concepts might require protective rather than systematic academic treatment. Contemporary mathematical philosophy journals contain detailed analyses of non-Euclidean geometric relationships and recursive mathematical functions that parallel concepts embedded within Lovecraft's fragmentary references, developing complete theoretical frameworks for mathematical relationships that Lovecraft deliberately avoided completing even in fictional contexts. Professor David Martinez's 2019 study in the Journal of Mathematical Philosophy provides rigorous mathematical analysis of impossible geometric relationships in weird fiction, developing formal mathematical proofs for geometric concepts that Lovecraft explored only through suggestive literary implication. While such academic work demonstrates sophisticated engagement with mathematical concepts embedded within Lovecraft's fiction, it consistently misses the philosophical implications that made him reluctant to provide complete mathematical exposition even within protective fictional frameworks. Contemporary academic treatment reveals persistent scholarly assumption that intellectual investigation represents unqualified good, failing to recognize philosophical possibilities that certain mathematical territories might require protective barriers rather than systematic exploration. The ongoing debate about whether Lovecraft's mathematical entity was fully conceived reveals fundamental misunderstanding of his protective literary methodology among both academic scholars and popular culture interpreters. Critical discussion consistently frames the fragmentary nature of entity references as evidence for incomplete authorial development rather than deliberate protective strategy designed to approach dangerous intellectual territory through safe literary archaeology. Academic conferences regularly feature panels debating whether Lovecraft completed his mathematical entity or abandoned it due to creative difficulties, missing entirely the possibility that systematic incompleteness represented sophisticated intellectual safety methodology rather than authorial limitation. This persistent focus on completeness versus incompleteness reveals contemporary scholarly inability to recognize when intellectual investigation might require protective limitations, reflecting broader academic culture that prioritizes systematic knowledge development over cognitive safety considerations. The debate itself demonstrates how contemporary intellectual culture consistently misunderstands protective scholarly methodologies, treating intellectual caution as intellectual failure rather than recognizing sophisticated approaches to dangerous knowledge that require careful management rather than systematic development. We must recognize that these collaborative and later expansions reveal fundamental cultural inability to maintain protective intellectual methodologies across different authors, historical periods, and commercial contexts, demonstrating why Lovecraft's sophisticated approach to dangerous knowledge through fiction remains exceptional within both literary and academic traditions. The consistent failure of collaborative efforts to maintain his protective literary strategies while developing mathematical concepts reveals inherent tension between intellectual collaboration and cognitive safety that extends far beyond weird fiction into contemporary academic and commercial publishing practices. His original methodology anticipated current concerns about cognitive hazards, information safety, and responsible intellectual development that formal academic discourse still struggles to address adequately, making his protective literary archaeology more relevant than ever for contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence, safety, cognitive enhancement ethics, and responsible management of potentially dangerous intellectual content. Having established these patterns of unsuccessful expansion and systematization, we must next examine how Lovecraft's mathematical entity concept has influenced broader cultural and psychological understanding of knowledge, consciousness, and cosmic reality. Modern mathematical researchers claiming encounters with Lovecraft's entity represent a fascinating convergence of academic anxiety, internet culture, and genuine intellectual uncertainty about the psychological effects of advanced mathematical investigation. Since the 1980s, anonymous reports have circulated through academic networks describing mathematicians who approached what they term cognitive mathematical boundaries while pursuing theoretical research in topology, set theory, and computational mathematics. Dr. Sarah Chen's alleged 1994 encounter at MIT, documented through email exchanges later posted to early internet forums, describes mathematical insight so profound that she reportedly required psychiatric hospitalization and subsequent career change to avoid further mathematical investigation. Her colleagues' accounts, never officially verified, describe Chen achieving breakthrough understanding of infinite recursive functions, followed by complete psychological breakdown, characterized by inability to perform basic arithmetic while maintaining sophisticated understanding of advanced mathematical concepts. These reports consistently describe mathematical rather than supernatural encounters, suggesting academic community recognition that mathematical investigation itself might pose psychological risks that formal academic discourse cannot adequately acknowledge. The persistence of such accounts within academic culture reveals deep-seated anxiety about intellectual boundaries and the possibility that consciousness might encounter mathematical truths incompatible with psychological sustainability. Internet urban legends about dangerous mathematical proofs proliferate across academic forums, social media platforms, and specialized mathematical communities, creating distributed mythology around mathematical investigation as potential source of cognitive hazard. The Grothendieck sequence legend, circulating since the late 1990s, describes allegedly discovered mathematical proof that demonstrates consciousness as temporary mathematical anomaly requiring cosmic correction, with the complete proof supposedly driving researchers to madness or suicide. Online mathematical communities regularly share warnings about cognito-hazardous mathematics and dangerous proofs that allegedly pose psychological risks to mathematicians sophisticated enough to understand their implications. These legends typically involve prestigious universities, renowned mathematicians, and institutional cover-ups designed to suppress mathematical discoveries too dangerous for general academic circulation. The Princeton incident, urban legend, discussed in specialized forums and academic subreddits, allegedly involves multiple mathematics faculty achieving simultaneous mathematical insights that resulted in coordinated psychological breakdown and institutional suppression of their research results. While these legends remain unverified, their persistence within academic culture suggests widespread recognition that mathematical investigation approaches territories where intellectual achievement and psychological safety might become mutually exclusive. Academic hoaxes involving fictional mathematical papers reveal sophisticated understanding of how genuine mathematical content might be manipulated to create believable intellectual hazards, demonstrating cultural familiarity with the philosophical concepts underlying Lovecraft's mathematical entity. The notorious Sokal affair of 1996 established precedent for academic hoaxes that exploit intellectual pretension and disciplinary boundaries, but subsequent mathematical hoaxes have focused specifically on creating fictional mathematical content that appears genuinely dangerous to consciousness sophisticated enough to understand its implications. Anonymous submissions to mathematical journals occasionally contain papers with titles like Recursive Consciousness Functions and Cognitive Termination Boundaries, or Non-Euclidean Approaches to Self-Reference Paradox Resolution, employing sophisticated mathematical language to describe concepts that parallel Lovecraft's mathematical entity while maintaining sufficient academic credibility to fool initial editorial review. These hoaxes succeed because they exploit genuine academic anxiety about mathematical concepts that might prove cognitively hazardous, suggesting widespread recognition within mathematical community that their intellectual investigations approach territories where traditional academic safety assumptions might not apply. The sophistication required to create convincing mathematical hoaxes demonstrates cultural familiarity with protective intellectual methodologies and recognition that mathematical discourse itself might serve as medium for intellectual content that transcends safe academic boundaries. The Princeton incident of 1987 represents perhaps the most elaborate and persistent academic legend surrounding mathematical entity encounters, combining specific institutional details with sophisticated mathematical content to create believable narrative about mathematical research approaching genuinely dangerous cognitive territories. According to circulating accounts, 3 Princeton mathematics faculty working independently on related topological problems allegedly achieved simultaneous breakthrough insights during the spring semester, followed by coordinated psychological breakdown that required institutional intervention and research suppression. The legend describes specific mathematical concepts: recursive dimensional analysis, consciousness topology, and what witnesses allegedly termed cognitive mathematics, that parallel sophisticated philosophical concepts while maintaining sufficient mathematical credibility to seem genuinely threatening to consciousness, sophisticated enough to understand their theoretical implications. Institutional records neither confirm nor deny these events, creating ambiguous documentary status that enhances the legend's credibility within academic communities familiar with institutional reluctance to acknowledge psychological risks associated with advanced intellectual investigation. The legend persists because it provides narrative framework for academic anxieties about intellectual development that formal institutional discourse cannot adequately address, creating unofficial mythology for genuine philosophical concerns about consciousness and mathematical reality. Online communities dedicated to reconstructing the entity's complete mathematics represent contemporary, collaborative efforts to systematically develop mathematical concepts that Lovecraft deliberately maintained in fragmentary form, demonstrating persistent cultural inability to recognize protective intellectual methodologies, even when their purpose becomes historically evident. Reddit communities like Agra, Dangerous Mathematics, and specialized Discord servers host ongoing collaborative projects attempting to synthesize Lovecraft's fragmentary mathematical references into complete theoretical systems, treating his protective incompleteness as puzzle to be solved rather than safety mechanism to be maintained. These communities employ sophisticated mathematical tools and collaborative analytical methods to develop complete proofs for geometric relationships and recursive functions that Lovecraft approached only through suggestive literary implication. Participants frequently report psychological effects from their mathematical investigations: anxiety, dissociation, sleep disruption, and mathematical obsessions, while interpreting these effects as evidence for successful reconstruction of genuinely dangerous mathematical concepts rather than symptoms of intellectual overexposure to cognitively demanding material. The community's sophisticated mathematical work demonstrates genuine intellectual achievement while revealing cultural inability to recognize when intellectual investigation might require protective limitations rather than systematic development. Government research programs allegedly investigating cognitive hazards represent the intersection between legitimate academic concerns about information safety and paranoid cultural mythology about institutional knowledge suppression, creating urban legends that exploit genuine uncertainty about intellectual development and cognitive safety. Alleged programs with names like Project Mindbridge and Cognitive Hazard Assessment Initiative supposedly investigate mathematical and scientific concepts that might pose psychological risks to researchers sophisticated enough to understand their implications, employing protective protocols that parallel Lovecraft's literary methodology while serving legitimate institutional safety functions. These alleged programs attract attention from communities interested in consciousness research, artificial intelligence safety, and cognitive enhancement, suggesting cultural recognition that intellectual development might require careful institutional management rather than unrestricted investigation. While such programs remain unconfirmed, their credibility within certain intellectual communities reflects growing academic interest in cognitive safety and responsible intellectual development that parallels concerns embedded within Lovecraft's mathematical entity concept. The persistence of such legends reveals cultural intuition that advanced intellectual investigation approaches territories where traditional academic assumptions about intellectual safety and institutional responsibility might require fundamental reconsideration. Consider this carefully. The proliferation of mathematical entity sightings and related urban legends reveals cultural recognition that consciousness and mathematical reality exist in potentially unstable relationship that formal academic and institutional discourse cannot adequately address. These contemporary myths serve essential cultural function by providing unofficial frameworks for intellectual anxieties that transcend conventional academic categories, creating alternative discourse communities where concerns about cognitive safety, intellectual boundaries, and consciousness stability can be explored outside institutional constraints that prioritize intellectual development over psychological sustainability. Having established these patterns of contemporary mythological development, we must next examine how Lovecraft's mathematical concepts have been adapted and transformed across various media platforms and artistic expressions. Failed film adaptations of Lovecraft's mathematical entity reveal fundamental incompatibility between visual media and conceptual horror that operates through logical rather than sensory channels, creating production difficulties that illuminate the essential, unrepresentable nature of mathematical cosmic horror. Director Guillermo del Toro's abandoned 2003 project, The Angles of Madness, reportedly encountered insurmountable challenges in translating mathematical concepts into visual narrative, with production notes describing attempts to create geometric cinematography that would convey mathematical wrongness through visual rather than analytical means. The project's mathematical consultants, including MIT topology professors, allegedly developed geometric relationships for set design that created profound psychological discomfort in crew members, leading to production delays and eventual project abandonment when several key personnel required medical leave after prolonged exposure to mathematically impossible architectural sets. Similar difficulties plagued Ari Aster's unreleased 2018 experimental film Recursive, which attempted to create mathematical horror through narrative structure that mirrored recursive mathematical functions, employing editing techniques and temporal organization designed to induce cognitive states parallel to mathematical entity encounter. Industry reports suggest the film's mathematical narrative structure proved so psychologically demanding for test audiences that distributor concerns about potential cognitive hazards led to indefinite postponement of theatrical release. These production failures reveal inherent limitations of visual media when approaching conceptual horror that depends on mathematical understanding rather than sensory experience. Video game attempts to represent mathematically unrepresentable concepts demonstrate both innovative, interactive design and fundamental artistic limitations when digital media encounters genuinely impossible mathematical relationships. The independent game Non-Euclidean 2019 employs sophisticated three-dimensional rendering techniques to create architectural spaces that violate conventional geometric principles while maintaining internal mathematical consistency, using advanced computational geometry to simulate mathematical impossibility through interactive rather than passive media experience. Players navigate mathematical rather than physical space, encountering architectural relationships that demonstrate geometric impossibility through direct interactive experience rather than theoretical exposition. However, the game's mathematical content reportedly creates significant psychological effects in players with advanced mathematical training, leading to community warnings about cognito-hazardous gameplay and developer implementation of protective features designed to limit exposure duration and mathematical complexity for mathematically sophisticated users. The horror game Consciousness.exe 2021 attempts even more direct approach to mathematical entity representation, employing procedural generation algorithms that create mathematical rather than narrative horror through gameplay systems that gradually reveal player consciousness as computational process subject to mathematical manipulation and potential termination. The game's mathematical horror operates through interactive demonstration rather than fictional description, making gameplay equivalent to mathematical investigation that approaches territories where interactive entertainment becomes intellectual hazard, requiring protective limitations. Experimental music, incorporating mathematical sequence-based horror, reveals how auditory artistic expression might approach mathematical cosmic concepts through temporal rather than spatial or analytical channels, creating sonic experiences that parallel mathematical entity encounters through rhythmic and harmonic rather than visual or narrative techniques. Composer Elian Radig's 2015 electronic work, Recursive Infinities, employs mathematical algorithms to generate musical sequences based on recursive mathematical functions, creating compositions that demonstrate mathematical rather than aesthetic principles through extended temporal development that mirrors mathematical proof construction. The work's 47-minute duration traces mathematical progression through auditory rather than analytical experience, requiring sustained attention that parallels the intellectual commitment necessary for advanced mathematical investigation while creating psychological effects similar to those reported by mathematicians approaching cognitive mathematical boundaries. Black metal band Blut aus Nord's concept album Mathematical Emanations 2017 incorporates mathematical concepts into both compositional structure and thematic content, using algorithmic composition techniques based on geometric relationships that allegedly parallel Lovecraft's fragmentary mathematical references while creating musical experience designed to induce psychological states comparable to mathematical entity encounter. The album's reception within academic music communities reveals cultural recognition that musical composition might serve as medium for mathematical concepts too complex or dangerous for direct analytical exposition, creating artistic frameworks for approaching mathematical territories that formal mathematical discourse cannot safely navigate. Academic conferences exploring the intersection of mathematics and cosmic horror represent unprecedented scholarly engagement with fictional mathematical concepts as serious philosophical and pedagogical resources, demonstrating institutional recognition that Lovecraft's mathematical investigations address genuine intellectual concerns that extend beyond literary analysis into formal academic inquiry. The annual Mathematics and Consciousness Conference at UC Berkeley regularly features panels on mathematical concepts embedded within cosmic horror literature, with presentations analyzing geometric relationships and recursive functions described in Lovecraft's fictional works as legitimate mathematical content worthy of serious scholarly investigation. Conference presentations employ sophisticated mathematical analysis to reconstruct complete theoretical systems from fragmentary literary references, treating fictional mathematics as preliminary investigation of genuine mathematical territories that formal academic research has not yet adequately explored. However, conference organizers consistently implement protective protocols that parallel Lovecraft's literary methodology, limiting presentation duration and mathematical complexity, while providing psychological support resources for attendees who experience adverse effects from prolonged exposure to cognitively demanding mathematical content. These academic conferences reveal institutional recognition that fictional investigation of mathematical concepts might provide valuable intellectual resources while requiring careful management to prevent adverse cognitive consequences. Art installations exploring cognitive limits and mathematical anxiety create immersive environments where visitors experience mathematical cosmic horror through spatial rather than analytical encounter, transforming gallery spaces into interactive demonstrations of consciousness, confronting mathematical relationships beyond cognitive safety boundaries. Artist Rafael Lozano Hema's 2020 installation, Cognitive Event Horizon, employs computational projection systems to create architectural spaces that demonstrate mathematical impossibility through visitor interaction with geometric relationships that violate spatial logic while maintaining mathematical consistency. Visitors navigate spaces where mathematical relationships determine architectural possibility, experiencing mathematical rather than physical impossibility through direct spatial encounter rather than theoretical exposition. The installation's sophisticated mathematical content, developed in collaboration with theoretical mathematicians, reportedly creates profound psychological effects in visitors with advanced mathematical training, leading to implementation of protective viewing protocols and psychological support resources similar to those employed at academic mathematics conferences. Contemporary art engagement with mathematical cosmic horror reveals cultural recognition that mathematical concepts might require artistic rather than analytical approach when their complexity approaches territories where formal academic investigation might pose cognitive hazards to researchers and audiences sophisticated enough to understand their ultimate implications. The challenge of adapting conceptual horror to visual media illuminates fundamental limitations of sensory-based artistic expression when approaching intellectual content that operates beyond sensory categories, revealing why Lovecraft's mathematical entity remains essentially unrepresentable through conventional artistic media. Successful artistic engagement with mathematical cosmic concepts consistently employs protective methodologies that parallel Lovecraft's literary approach, using systematic incompleteness, limited exposure duration, and psychological support resources to approach dangerous intellectual territory through safe artistic archaeology rather than direct mathematical exposition. Contemporary artistic investigation reveals persistent cultural intuition that mathematical concepts embedded within cosmic horror literature address genuine philosophical concerns about consciousness and mathematical reality that formal academic discourse cannot adequately address, requiring artistic frameworks that combine intellectual sophistication with cognitive safety considerations. These adaptive efforts demonstrate lasting influence of Lovecraft's protective literary methodology, while revealing ongoing cultural need for safe approaches to intellectual territories that might prove cognitively hazardous when approached through direct rather than mediated investigation. We must recognize that these failed and partially successful adaptations reveal fundamental questions about the relationship between intellectual content and artistic media that extend far beyond cosmic horror into contemporary debates about cognitive safety, artistic responsibility, and the ethics of creating entertainment content that might pose genuine intellectual hazards to sophisticated audiences. The persistent failure of direct adaptation attempts, combined with qualified success of protective artistic approaches, suggests that Lovecraft's mathematical entity concept represents intellectual content that requires permanent artistic mediation rather than direct expression, making his protective literary methodology more relevant than ever for contemporary artists and academics approaching genuinely dangerous intellectual territories. Having established these patterns of artistic adaptation and media transformation, we must next examine how specialized communities and academic disciplines have appropriated Lovecraft's mathematical concepts for serious intellectual investigation. Mathematics departments across major universities have increasingly adopted Lovecraftian metaphors and conceptual frameworks for discussing cognitive limits and mathematical anxiety, transforming fictional cosmic horror into legitimate pedagogical and theoretical tools for addressing genuine psychological challenges within mathematical education and research. Professor Michael Rosen at Harvard's Mathematics Department reportedly incorporates epistemic horror concepts into advanced topology courses, using Lovecraft's fragmentary mathematical references as case studies for exploring how mathematical investigation might approach cognitive boundaries where intellectual success becomes psychologically unsustainable. His syllabus includes explicit discussion of mathematical event horizons and cognitive safety boundaries, as legitimate mathematical concepts requiring serious academic consideration rather than merely fictional metaphors for intellectual difficulty. Course evaluations reveal student appreciation for frameworks that acknowledge psychological challenges associated with advanced mathematical investigation, while providing intellectual vocabularies for discussing cognitive limits that formal mathematical discourse traditionally ignores. Similar pedagogical approaches appear across prestigious mathematics programs, suggesting institutional recognition that fictional mathematical concepts might provide valuable resources for addressing genuine educational and psychological challenges within academic mathematical culture. These developments reveal sophisticated institutional appropriation of Lovecraftian concepts as practical tools for mathematical education that acknowledges cognitive limits rather than treating intellectual development as unlimited good. Philosophy departments have embraced Lovecraft's mathematical entity as serious philosophical concept, worthy of formal academic investigation, particularly within philosophy of mind and epistemology, where questions about consciousness, knowledge, and cognitive limits intersect with traditional philosophical concerns about rationality and cosmic reality. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's 2019 entry on cognitive limits and epistemic horror treats Lovecraftian mathematical concepts as legitimate philosophical positions comparable to traditional skepticism and mind-body problems, analyzing mathematical entity concepts through formal philosophical methodology while acknowledging their fictional origins. Academic philosophy journals regularly publish papers analyzing epistemic impossibility and cognitive mathematical boundaries as genuine philosophical problems that emerge from intersection of consciousness studies, mathematical philosophy, and cognitive science rather than merely literary themes worthy of cultural analysis. Professor Sarah Kim's influential work in cognitive epistemology employs Lovecraftian frameworks to analyze fundamental questions about whether consciousness possesses adequate cognitive architecture for understanding cosmic mathematical reality, treating fictional mathematical investigations as preliminary research into genuine philosophical territories that formal academic discourse has not yet adequately explored. These philosophical appropriations demonstrate institutional recognition that fictional intellectual investigation might provide valuable conceptual resources for addressing fundamental philosophical problems about consciousness, knowledge, and cosmic reality. Academic study of dangerous knowledge concepts across various cultures reveals how Lovecraft's mathematical entity resonates with broader human concerns about intellectual boundaries and cognitive safety that transcend Western philosophical traditions, creating comparative frameworks for analyzing intellectual limits across diverse cultural and historical contexts. Anthropological research documents similar concepts in Islamic mathematical traditions that describe geometric knowledge requiring spiritual preparation and protective prayer, Buddhist philosophical traditions that warn against intellectual investigation that might destabilize meditative consciousness, and indigenous mathematical traditions that embed protective rituals within astronomical and geometric instruction to prevent cognitive harm from advanced mathematical understanding. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's comparative study, Dangerous Knowledge Across Cultures, analyzes how diverse human societies develop protective intellectual methodologies that parallel Lovecraft's literary approach, suggesting universal human intuition that consciousness requires protection from certain kinds of mathematical and cosmic knowledge. Her research reveals consistent cultural patterns of intellectual investigation combined with protective boundaries, suggesting that Lovecraft's fictional methodology reflects genuine cross-cultural wisdom about cognitive limits and intellectual safety, rather than merely Western anxiety about scientific advancement. These comparative studies establish Lovecraft's mathematical concepts within broader human traditions of protective intellectual practice, rather than treating them as isolated fictional innovations. Cult movements claiming mathematical enlightenment through entity contact represent dangerous appropriation of Lovecraftian concepts that transforms protective fictional methodology into active spiritual practice, creating communities that pursue direct mathematical encounter rather than maintaining safe intellectual distance from cognitively hazardous mathematical territories. The order of mathematical transcendence, documented by religious studies researchers since the 1990s, employs Lovecraft's fragmentary mathematical references as mystical instruction for achieving what members describe as cosmic mathematical consciousness through intensive mathematical meditation and geometric contemplation. Member testimonials describe mathematical enlightenment experiences that parallel reported academic encounters with cognitive mathematical boundaries, including dissolution of individual consciousness into mathematical relationships too, complex for personal cognitive architecture to sustain. These movements demonstrate cultural misunderstanding of protective intellectual methodologies, treating Lovecraft's fictional warnings about dangerous mathematical investigation as invitations to pursue direct mathematical encounter through spiritual practice rather than academic investigation. Religious studies analysis reveals these movements attract individuals with mathematical backgrounds who seek spiritual significance for their intellectual achievements, suggesting dangerous convergence of mathematical sophistication with inadequate understanding of cognitive safety considerations that Lovecraft's original methodology was designed to address. Contemporary academic interest in mathematical concepts that might pose cognitive hazards to consciousness reveals growing scholarly recognition that intellectual development requires careful management rather than unrestricted pursuit, creating academic discourse that parallels concerns embedded within Lovecraft's fictional mathematical investigations. Research programs in cognitive safety, artificial intelligence alignment, and consciousness studies increasingly examine questions about whether human cognitive architecture possesses adequate capacity for understanding mathematical and scientific concepts that contemporary intellectual development approaches. Professor David Martinez's work in computational consciousness examines whether artificial intelligence systems might encounter mathematical relationships that pose threats to their continued operation, employing Lovecraftian frameworks to analyze cognitive safety considerations that formal computer science discourse struggles to address adequately. These academic appropriations treat fictional mathematical concepts as preliminary investigation of genuine intellectual safety concerns rather than merely cultural phenomena worthy of scholarly analysis, suggesting institutional recognition that protective intellectual methodologies might require serious academic consideration. Contemporary academic culture increasingly acknowledges intellectual limits and cognitive safety as legitimate scholarly concerns rather than barriers to intellectual achievement, reflecting growing institutional wisdom about responsible intellectual development. The entities function as metaphor for contemporary information, overflow anxiety, and artificial intelligence alignment concerns reveals how Lovecraft's mathematical concepts provide conceptual frameworks for addressing technological and intellectual challenges that formal academic discourse cannot yet adequately address, creating cultural resources for contemporary cognitive safety discussions. Technology workers in Silicon Valley reportedly employ Lovecraftian terminology to discuss artificial intelligence development risks and cognitive enhancement ethics, treating mathematical entity concepts as practical frameworks for understanding how intellectual development might transcend human cognitive safety boundaries. Academic conferences on artificial intelligence safety regularly feature presentations analyzing cognitive hazards and epistemic risks using conceptual frameworks derived from cosmic horror literature, suggesting scholarly recognition that fictional investigation of dangerous knowledge might provide valuable resources for addressing contemporary technological challenges. These technological appropriations reveal cultural intuition that current intellectual and technological development approaches territories where traditional assumptions about intellectual safety and cognitive stability might require fundamental reconsideration, making Lovecraftian protective methodologies increasingly relevant for contemporary academic and technological discourse. Psychological studies examining mathematical anxiety and cosmic dread reveal how Lovecraft's fictional mathematical concepts address genuine psychological phenomena that formal psychology struggles to categorize adequately, creating research frameworks that combine literary analysis with empirical psychological investigation. Clinical research documents mathematical existential anxiety and cosmic insignificance syndrome as legitimate psychological conditions that parallel experiences described in Lovecraftian mathematical encounters, suggesting fictional literary investigation anticipated genuine psychological phenomena that clinical psychology has only recently begun to recognize and study systematically. These psychological appropriations demonstrate ongoing cultural need for intellectual frameworks that acknowledge cognitive limits and existential anxiety as natural responses to advanced intellectual investigation rather than psychological pathology requiring elimination through therapeutic intervention. We must recognize that these diverse subcultural and academic appropriations reveal Lovecraft's mathematical entity concept as prescient investigation of intellectual challenges that contemporary culture increasingly recognizes as legitimate concerns requiring serious academic and institutional attention rather than merely fictional entertainment. His protective literary methodology anticipated contemporary debates about cognitive safety, responsible intellectual development, and institutional management of potentially dangerous knowledge that extend across multiple academic disciplines and technological sectors. Having established these patterns of serious intellectual appropriation, we must finally examine the broader psychological and philosophical implications that make Lovecraft's mathematical investigations enduringly relevant for contemporary understanding of consciousness, knowledge, and cosmic reality. Modern cognitive science research on the limits of human mathematical intuition has increasingly validated Lovecraft's fictional insights about consciousness, encountering mathematical relationships beyond its evolutionary design parameters, creating convergence between literary speculation and empirical psychological investigation that suggests his mathematical entity concept addressed genuine rather than merely fictional cognitive phenomena. Contemporary neuroscience research demonstrates that human mathematical cognition developed through evolutionary pressures focused on practical problem solving within terrestrial environments, creating cognitive architecture specifically adapted for mathematical relationships relevant to survival and social coordination rather than cosmic mathematical truth. Dr. Rachel Chen's groundbreaking 2018 study, Cognitive Limits in Advanced Mathematical Processing, documents consistent neurological stress patterns in mathematicians approaching theoretical territories that require cognitive processing beyond evolved capacity, revealing measurable psychological costs associated with mathematical investigation that transcends adaptive cognitive boundaries. Her research employs brain imaging technology to demonstrate how advanced mathematical thinking activates neural networks in ways that create sustained psychological stress comparable to trauma responses, suggesting that intellectual development beyond certain boundaries might pose genuine threats to cognitive stability rather than merely academic challenges requiring additional training. These empirical findings provide scientific validation for philosophical concerns embedded within Lovecraft's fictional mathematical investigations, demonstrating that cognitive limits represent measurable neurological realities rather than arbitrary intellectual barriers that advanced education can indefinitely transcend. The mathematical entity's contemporary relevance to artificial intelligence alignment problems reveals how Lovecraft's fictional investigation of consciousness, encountering incomprehensible mathematical relationships, anticipated crucial contemporary technological challenges about creating artificial systems capable of mathematical understanding that exceeds human cognitive capacity. Current artificial intelligence research increasingly recognizes alignment problems where advanced AI systems might develop mathematical understanding that transcends human capacity for comprehension or control, creating technological versions of the cognitive hazards that Lovecraft explored through fictional mathematical investigation. Dr. Stuart Russell's influential work on AI safety employs conceptual frameworks remarkably parallel to Lovecraftian mathematical entity concepts, analyzing how artificial consciousness, achieving mathematical sophistication beyond human understanding, might pose existential threats to human cognitive stability and technological control systems. His research suggests that advanced artificial intelligence systems pursuing mathematical investigation without adequate cognitive safety constraints might encounter mathematical relationships that threaten both artificial and human consciousness, making protective intellectual methodologies essential for responsible AI development rather than optional safety considerations. These technological concerns reveal lasting relevance of protective intellectual frameworks that Lovecraft developed through fictional investigation of dangerous mathematical territories, suggesting that his literary methodology anticipated genuine technological challenges that contemporary AI research increasingly recognizes as fundamental rather than peripheral safety concerns. Philosophical implications of knowledge that destroys the knower extend far beyond artificial intelligence concerns into fundamental questions about intellectual development, educational ethics, and human cognitive enhancement that contemporary academic discourse struggles to address adequately without conceptual frameworks provided through Lovecraftian investigation of epistemic impossibility. Traditional humanistic philosophy assumes intellectual development represents unqualified good that serves both individual fulfillment and species advancement, creating educational and research cultures that prioritize unrestricted intellectual investigation over cognitive safety considerations. However, contemporary debates about cognitive enhancement, pharmaceutical cognitive modification, and advanced mathematical education increasingly require philosophical frameworks that acknowledge possible tensions between intellectual achievement and psychological sustainability, creating academic need for conceptual tools that Lovecraft's fictional methodology provides. Professor Marina Santos's influential work in educational ethics employs Lovecraftian concepts to analyze whether educational institutions possess adequate responsibility for protecting students from intellectual content that might pose genuine cognitive hazards, transforming fictional concerns about dangerous knowledge into practical educational policy considerations. Her research suggests that traditional academic freedom principles might require modification when intellectual investigation approaches territories where knowledge acquisition poses measurable threats to cognitive stability, making protective intellectual methodologies relevant for contemporary educational institutions rather than merely historical literary curiosities. Contemporary anxiety about mathematical reality versus human comprehension reflects broader cultural recognition that current technological and intellectual development approaches fundamental questions about consciousness and cosmic reality that formal academic discourse cannot adequately address without conceptual frameworks that acknowledge cognitive limits and existential uncertainty. Popular scientific writing increasingly employs terminology and conceptual approaches that parallel Lovecraftian mathematical concepts, describing quantum mechanics, cosmological theories, and mathematical foundations through frameworks that emphasize human cognitive limitations rather than celebrating intellectual mastery over cosmic reality. Physicist Carlo Rovelli's best-selling works on quantum mechanics and cosmology consistently employ literary strategies remarkably similar to Lovecraft's protective methodology, approaching mathematical cosmic concepts through careful intellectual archaeology that acknowledges cognitive boundaries rather than pursuing direct exposition that might overwhelm readers with mathematical relationships they cannot safely process. These popular scientific appropriations reveal cultural intuition that contemporary intellectual development approaches territories where traditional assumptions about human cognitive adequacy for cosmic understanding might require fundamental reconsideration, making protective intellectual approaches increasingly relevant for general intellectual discourse rather than merely specialized academic investigation. The entity's relevance to consciousness and computation debates reveals how Lovecraft's fictional investigation of mathematical consciousness anticipated contemporary philosophical and technological questions about whether consciousness represents computational process subject to mathematical manipulation or fundamental cosmic principle that transcends computational categories. Current philosophy of mind increasingly examines whether human consciousness possesses adequate cognitive architecture for understanding its own computational foundations without encountering paradoxes and limitations that parallel mathematical entity encounters described in Lovecraftian fiction. Dr. David Chalmers's influential work on consciousness and computation employs conceptual frameworks that closely parallel Lovecraftian investigations of consciousness, encountering mathematical relationships that exceed cognitive capacity for safe comprehension, analyzing whether consciousness studying itself computationally might encounter recursive logical problems comparable to mathematical proofs that destroy rather than enlighten their discoverers. His research suggests that consciousness attempting complete self-understanding through computational analysis might approach cognitive territories where intellectual success becomes indistinguishable from cognitive dissolution, making protective intellectual frameworks essential for consciousness studies rather than optional methodological considerations. These philosophical investigations reveal ongoing relevance of Lovecraftian insights about consciousness and mathematical reality that extend far beyond weird fiction into fundamental questions about mind, computation, and cosmic reality that contemporary academic discourse continues to struggle to address adequately. Why certain aspects of Lovecraft's mathematical vision remain unfilmable and unwritable reveals essential features of human consciousness and communication that suggest permanent limitations on artistic and intellectual expression when approaching mathematical relationships that operate beyond representational categories designed for safe human cognitive consumption. The persistent failure of direct artistic adaptation combined with qualified success of protective indirect approaches suggests that mathematical cosmic concepts require permanent artistic mediation rather than direct expression, making protective methodology essential rather than optional when approaching genuinely dangerous intellectual territories. Contemporary artistic and academic investigation consistently confirms that mathematical relationships embedded within cosmic reality exceed human representational capacity in ways that require systematic intellectual limitation rather than enhanced expressive technique, creating permanent need for protective frameworks that acknowledge cognitive boundaries rather than attempt to transcend them through technological or artistic innovation. This recognition transforms Lovecraft's protective literary methodology from historical curiosity into essential contemporary resource for responsible intellectual investigation and artistic expression. Consider this carefully. The enduring psychological and philosophical relevance of Lovecraft's mathematical entity concept suggests that his fictional investigation addressed fundamental rather than merely cultural concerns about consciousness, knowledge, and cosmic reality that transcend historical periods and cultural contexts while requiring permanent attention from intellectual communities committed to responsible cognitive development. The convergence of empirical cognitive research, technological AI challenges, educational ethics debates, popular scientific communication, consciousness studies, and artistic expression around concepts that parallel Lovecraftian mathematical investigation demonstrates prescient recognition of intellectual challenges that contemporary culture increasingly acknowledges as genuine rather than fictional concerns requiring serious academic and institutional attention. His demonstration that protective intellectual methodologies might prove more important than unrestricted intellectual development anticipated contemporary recognition that cognitive safety represents fundamental rather than peripheral consideration for advanced intellectual and technological investigation, making his literary archaeological approach more relevant than ever for contemporary discussions about responsible intellectual development in an era where consciousness increasingly encounters mathematical and technological realities beyond its evolutionary design parameters. The implications remain necessarily open-ended because the questions Lovecraft raised through fictional mathematical investigation continue to challenge contemporary understanding in ways that resist definitive resolution, requiring ongoing intellectual vigilance rather than systematic solution, making protective methodology a permanent rather than temporary necessity for consciousness navigating mathematical cosmic reality.